Good morning, everybody. As everybody is still gathering, we'll start right at 10. Matt, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Christensen, and I am FERC's General Counsel. This is the time and place that has been noticed for the third meeting of the Joint Federal-State Task Force on Electric Transmission to consider the matters that have been posted in the agenda issued on April 22nd, 2022, and docket 80-2115. This meeting is on the record, and a transcript will be placed into that docket. The public can listen and observe online only. Any comments by the public can be submitted into that docket through FERC's e-filing system, which you can access via the FERC website. Today's discussion will avoid the merits of any pending contested matter, and I will interrupt discussions if we enter that territory. Under the Commission's ex parte regulations, task force members can address general matters raised in a pending contested proceeding, but should not speak to the specific merits of any such proceeding. I'll note that does not include generic proceedings, such as the Commission's recent notice of proposed rulemaking on transmission planning and cost allocation, which are not covered by the Commission's ex parte regulations. With that, I will turn the meeting over to the task force co-chairs, FERC Chairman Rich Glick and Maryland Public Service Commission Chair Jason Stanek, for any opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome to everybody. Good morning to everybody. Welcome to our third meeting of the Joint Task Force. I also especially want to welcome our colleagues in the West. We're up at a very early hour. Apologize for that, but appreciate your willingness to participate at such an early time. I want to begin by, as usual, thanking the NARUC team and the FERC team for all the hard work they put into this task force, the task force itself, but the meetings today as well. It takes a lot of preparation in advance to get us to where we are today. And we want to thank both the FERC and the NARUC team members for doing this. Before we dive into today's subject, which is generator interconnection reform, I did want to note that I'm sure it hasn't escaped people's attention that we issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. FERC did a couple of weeks ago, covering transmission planning and cost allocation. Two very important issues that we had covered. We've covered already on the in the task force, the first two task force meetings, and I'm sure everyone has memorized the full 500 pages. And just in case, we can certainly talk about that today if you like. But I want to point out the NOPA really because I think it's a good example of how important this task force is. The discussions that we had in the first two sessions, I think, helped frame the commissioners. I know it helped frame my views, and I suspect my colleagues' views as well. And it showed up. I think some of that's demonstrated in the document that we issued a couple of weeks ago, particularly when it comes to cost allocation. We heard from a number of state commissioners on the task force how important it is to include the views of the states in the cost allocation process, and we proposed to do just that in the NOPR. And I think that's a notable example. And I think, I suspect today's discussion will have further impetus upon the commission to consider, obviously, the views of the members as we move forward on other issues. And again, the subject of today's conference, interconnection reform, is something that I'm very much hoping the commission, FERC, gets to relatively quickly. I think there's a lot to be done on that. I think everyone is well aware, and I think we're gonna have a great discussion this morning about the queue, the backlogs in the transmission queues, the fact that we need to do a lot of work to get things moving along more quickly. I think that includes a lot of work focused on transmission providers. It also includes a lot of work focused on generators as well. I think we need to make significant changes on both sides to get things moving along. And then this afternoon, we're going to have a discussion about participant funding and really of funding, how we allocate the costs associated with network upgrades. I know that there are very strong views on about this particular subject, and I think that will show up today when we have that discussion this afternoon. I will say, from my perspective, I think we do need to consider reforms to the current approach to participant funding in some regions of the country. I think from both a legal perspective and practical perspective, I think the status quo may not be workable. I would say, though, that this is not an all or nothing issue. Sometimes we get in this debate about participant funding and we think, is it 100% for the generator or is it 100% for load? And I don't think that's necessarily all or nothing. I think there are various ways of looking at this, and I assume that we're going to be having a good discussion about that very subject this afternoon. Before I turn it over to Chairman Stanek, I did want to thank Dr. Rob for participating. Dr. Rob did an amazing job, I thought, during our last conference, our last task force meeting, in terms of getting the discussion going. I know he will do the same again today. And with that, I want to welcome everyone again and turn it over to Chairman Stanek for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Glick, and good morning to everybody. As we begin this third task force meeting today, it's clear that what we set out on nearly 1 year ago has resulted in a very productive path for tackling some of these most critical issues that have challenged the development of transmission across our country. While this task force was formed independent of the ANOPR, the discussions of this body has clearly, as Chairman Glick just stated, had a substantive impact on the contents of that NOPR. The state regulators on this panel have appreciated the opportunity to help our FERC colleagues better frame this issue and to propose long-term solutions for transmission planning. Like Chairman Glick, I'm confident that today's discussion will take us one step further by addressing another key topic in the ANOPR, that is generator interconnection reform. This issue obviously goes hand in hand with transmission planning. They are both interdependent elements of developing needed transmission infrastructure and share many of the very same principles and challenges. But the very key difference here is that the generator interconnection needs are much more focused and much more immediate. This is an issue that we could tackle now and not have to wait 20 years to see if the fruits of our labor yielded success. And how well these new processes are implemented will determine that success. We know that across our 5 NARUC regions, developers are lining up to develop new generating resources, and that both grid operators and our local distribution utilities are doing their best to integrate these new products and projects. But we know that serious and growing challenges exist both in the RTO markets and in the bilateral markets. Of course, efficient generator interconnection is the foundation for long-term transmission planning, and fixing our generator interconnection problems now will move the needle towards developing a very cost-effective grid, which I think we could all agree upon. Since our last task force meeting, the 10 state commissioners have discussed this issue and discussed our regional experiences after reviewing the ANOPR comments on generator interconnection issues, both issues related to the backlog as well as issues related to cost allocation. My 9 colleagues on the state side have been very committed, and I appreciate their support. The commitment has stretched so far as to having Commissioner French from Kansas join us today. Happy to announce that him and his wife had a son earlier this week, James Aldo French, and yet he is here with us today. So congratulations, Andrew. I am confident that today's discussions of possible solutions, we know what the problem is. It's solutions that we need to discuss today, that these discussions will be productive, and even more so with Dr. Rab's expert facilitation. So I am looking forward to the dialogue today, and thank you, Dr. Rab, for facilitating yet again.
Thank you for having me. And we wanted to just go over a few things and then get right into the substance. And we're looking forward to a very productive task force meeting again today. I wanted to note that we made 2 changes to the format and approach to this meeting compared to the last meeting that we hope will reinforce the really joint problem-solving goal of this task force. First, we're not just asking questions this time, but have pre-identified along with the commissioners various potential improvements that we're seeking feedback on. And second, for each question or potential improvement that we plan to discuss, we pre-identified a pairing of 1 or 2 state task force members and 1 FERC task force member to provide some initial remarks and get us deep into each of the potential solutions and questions quickly before we're opening it up to the other task force members. So since this is our first task force meeting that's entirely on Zoom, we want to just go quickly over a few protocols for the meeting today. The first is please leave your camera on for the duration of the meeting. We want this to look and feel like an in-person task force meeting as much as possible. But that said, we do want you to mute and unmute your audio before you speak and turn it off after. If any task force member wants to weigh in during the conversation, besides those who have been volunteered / recruited to make some initial remarks, use the hand raise function in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's a little hand. And that'll automatically cue you to speak. And then please wait for me to call on you before you speak. And remember also to put your hand down after you've spoken. So we're using that instead of the 10 card raising. And it also cues automatically, so I'll just be following that cue. The Q&A function has been disabled, and the chat function, while it's on, we ask you not to use the chat function because we want you to prevent any non-public substantive discussions. If you have any technical problems or any other administrative matters, if you either email, text, or call Tanya at the coordinates that we sent you yesterday, and then she'll relay those to the technical folks and get you straightened out. The audience is going to be in watch, observe only mode today. Just 2 other things, a reminder to all of our state commissioners on the task force that you're generally here to represent your region's view, but you're also welcome to insert your state or personal view as well. Just if you can indicate when you're doing that, that would be helpful. And then a reminder to all task force members, we've asked for the initial remarks that you'll all be making on different questions or topics, to keep those under 3 minutes each, so we can preserve enough time to hear from other task force members and have a robust discussion. And similarly, if all task force members can be as succinct as possible when making comments, because we have a lot of hopefully very fertile ground that we hope to cover today, and we'll be moving at a pretty fast clip. But we also want to hear from all of you. So please raise your hand and share with us your thoughts. So if we can go to the agenda for today, just to orient everybody, we have two big topics we're covering. In the morning, we'll talk about the generator interconnection queue process and the current backlog. We'll take a break for lunch from around 12:15 to 1:15, and in the afternoon, we'll talk about the cost allocation for generator interconnection related network upgrades. So let's try and keep our cost allocation related comments to the afternoon because we want to look at different issues this morning, and then we'll have some closing remarks. So with that, any questions from the task force members before we roll up our sleeves and just launch right into it? Okay, seeing none then, we're off to the first topic on generation interconnection queue process and the current backlog. If we could go back to the slide deck and show the LB&L slide. A couple of weeks ago, while we were working hard on the agenda on this, LB&L put out their periodic data study on the interconnection to the transmission system queuing issues. We circulated that to all the task force members just to look it over as background information. And we just want to start by orienting everybody. This is just a very high level summary of some of the main points that were in this recent LB&L study. First, this shows the queue for each of the regions, and all the way on the right, you can see for all the regions combined. And a few things to note. One is that the queue's been growing every year significantly, and the queue is pretty large at this point. It's over 1,000 gigawatt of proposed generation capacity and 420 gigawatts of storage. We also see that there's an increase of hybrids and a very small share at this point, diminishing share of gas in the queue. And the dark green, you see the introduction of offshore wind in the queue coming up on mainly on the East Coast. The other 2 points that we wanted to just highlight again before we get into it as background is that for the 5 regions where data was available to LB&L, the time projects are spending in the queue before being built has increased from around 2 years for projects from 2000 to 2010 to almost double to 3.7 years for projects that have been in the queue for the last 10 years. And also that finally, that only 23% of projects that requested interconnection from 2000 to 2016 have reached commercial operations. That's lower for wind, 20%, and 16% even lower for solar projects that have been in the queue. And there have been almost 3/4 of the projects for a whole variety of reasons withdrawing from the queue. So with that as kind of the backdrop, we can go to the next slide. So the way that we have this session designed is the goal is to identify specific potential improvements that can efficiently, fairly, safely, reliably, and in a timely manner interconnect transmission level generation resources. And we have an introductory conversation that we want to have about the causes and the challenges. As Chair Stanek said, it's pretty well known, but I think we want to name those things before we start talking about the solutions. So the first thing we'll talk about is recognizing the existence of significant interconnection queue backlogs across most of the country. What are the primary challenges preventing more efficient processing of those queues? And then we'll spend the bulk of the time talking about what could be the most impactful improvements to address these queuing backlogs, and what specifically should FERC and the RTOs and states do to implement any recommended changes. And we'll talk about the specific solutions when we get to that point, but we're going to start now with discussing the challenges. And you can go ahead and take the slide down, and we were going to start with initial remarks from Chair Thomas from Arkansas, followed by FERC Commissioner Phillips, and then we'll open it up. So if you can jump into the queue at any time and raise your hands, the other task force members, and then once the 2 commissioners are finished, we'll open it up.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. Houston, we have a problem. As stated in the NARUC ANOPR comments, the existing methods for interconnection of new resources to the transmission grid are inadequate and inefficient because of the time necessary to interconnect new resources and the corresponding network upgrade costs. The urgency of this problem is taking the same upward trajectory as shown on a natural gas price chart. This urgency is up about 30% in the last 3 weeks. It is urgent that consumers have alternatives to natural gas-fired generation at these price levels. Potential alternatives to the high prices of natural gas have been limited through what I describe as the stupid fuel wars, a process by which the donor bases of both political parties promote the interests of producers of energy, often at the expense of consumer of energy, usually while hiding behind a jobs argument. The imbecilic actions of the United States Department of Commerce, again, a donor-driven political imperative masquerading as a jobs argument, has nearly imposed a construction moratorium on solar power plants needed as an alternative to gas-fired generation. To sum it up, my ratepayers cannot afford this bull blank. While these concerns are beyond the scope of this meeting, the interconnection queue is squarely within the scope of this meeting, and it is urgent that we do all we can to provide alternatives for ratepayers. My ratepayers cannot afford to have generation alternatives languish in interconnection queues that are sometimes more than 1,000 days in duration. As stated in the NARUC ANOPR comments, they're not only queue times increasing, but the cost of interconnection is also increasing. Analysis from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory attributes much of this increase to interconnection costs to the cost of upgrading the bulk transmission system. For this reason, the interconnection queue issues and transmission planning issues are inextricably intertwined. But today, the spotlight is on the interconnection issues. The problem is urgent, and I look forward to discussion of potential solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. I think one of the main challenges we're facing right now is an unprecedented amount of new interconnection requests due in large part to the changing resource mix, more renewables, and new technologies, including hybrid and offshore wind. As of the end of 2021, over 1,300 gigawatts of renewable storage and hybrid resources were waiting in the interconnection queues. The pro forma large generator interconnection agreement requires transmission providers to make reasonable efforts to meet study deadlines, but many transmission providers are overloaded and not able to meet the processing deadlines in their tariffs. Studies are taking 4 or 5 years in some cases. I've heard from some transmission providers, and I've heard them say that there are not even enough qualified engineers available to do the required interconnection studies. But another problem, and this was touched on already, is that the queues contain many speculative projects. And as noted, less than 25% of projects ever reach commercial operation, and many projects are waiting in queues for over 3 years. This is simply untenable. The serial first come, first served study process incentivizes developers to enter into the queue before they are ready. They do this so that they can snag a spot in line. Interconnection customers also submit multiple interconnection requests at different locations, even though they know that not all of them will reach commercial operation. They do this to find out where they can get assigned the least amount of network cost upgrades. Then there are often late stage withdrawals or material modifications to projects, which means that transmission providers must conduct restudies. And since the process is serial, transmission providers have to do a different study for each project. Ultimately, this is harming the ability of transmission providers to timely process the queue. Now, I know we'll talk about the issue of who pays a little later today, But the network upgrades identified in interconnection studies are getting bigger and bigger. And as we know, the upgrades are increasingly large, high voltage facilities. This just exacerbates the queue problems because once again, generators are submitting multiple interconnection requests as a form of price discovery and ultimately withdrawing many of these requests, triggering more restudies. I think it's telling that until recently, interconnection costs used to be less than 10% of a generator's total project cost. And now they can be over 50, 60, even 70%. SPP published a study of their recent cycle, which has a network upgrade cost of over $8 billion, that's billion dollars with the B, for approximately 2,200 megawatts of installed generation capacity. I applaud the Joint Task Force for taking up this important and significant topic, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I think before we go on to talking about individual solutions, it's a good chance for others to pile on to what we've just heard about increasing interconnection costs from 10% to over 50% in some regions, the filing of multiple projects as a sort of a price discovery in a speculative way, and entering the queue often before the generators are really ready, and then multiple modifications causing restudying and then pulling out of the queue. So let's just so we kind of have a common understanding of what the problems are. If we want to add to that, we've got Commissioner French, then Commissioner LeVar, then Commissioner Allen.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be very brief because a lot of this is actually something I want to talk about later, but I think it's worth reiterating a lot of what Commissioner Phillips said just there, which is when we hear about these problems and efforts to mitigate a lot of the problems associated with queue backlogs, it's important to recognize that those are symptoms. Those are not the problem. Those are symptoms of queue-based planning. And I think as policymakers, when we see a big problem like this, we don't just want to address those symptoms. We want to understand what is the root cause that got us here. And both Commissioner Phillips and Commissioner Thomas identified that. It was the lack of long-range planning over the last 5 or 10 years, the failure to identify the coming demand for these remote fuel savings, renewable-based resources over that time period, and to create the capacity for their interconnection as they were coming along. And so I think while we need to, in the interim, try to address the demand for those resources and address what's in the queues now, we can't lose sight of the fact that the ultimate long-term solution is better long-range planning. And so to me, I just want to reiterate the ultimate key issue in this entire meeting is how do we balance addressing the short-term issues in the interim with perhaps a more optimal long-term solution for customers. So that would be my comment and identification of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner LeVar?
Thank you, Dr. Rob, and I appreciate what Chairman Thomas and Commissioner Phillips said to outline this issue. Nobody uses the interconnection queue process as the poster child for what's going best in the energy system in the United States. It's an easy process to criticize, but I also want to make sure that we recognize the significant reform efforts that many transmission providers across the country have been engaging in recent years. There have been a lot of reform efforts. The specific issues that we'll be talking about over the next couple hours aren't new concepts that nobody's been trying. And recognizing that, I hope we have as part of the conversation a discussion about what barriers might exist to individual generators bringing complaints to FERC against existing tariffs or enforcement of existing tariffs, to focus on maybe the outliers, the ones that aren't trying to engage in reform and aren't making the good faith efforts that many are to really make this process more meaningful, more efficient, more transparent for everyone. So if there are barriers to either generators bringing cases to enforce existing tariffs or to look at whether case-by-case instances of tariffs ought to be modified, I hope that's part of the conversation before wholesale changes that require tariff changes across the board. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Allen, then Chair Stanek.
Thank you. I'll be quick. So I appreciate Commissioner LeBlanc's comments about the significant work that actually has been done today. All the regions that I've looked at closely have actually made some pretty good efforts and are making good progress toward reforms. Often there's some different approaches, and I think ultimately there needs to be some room for flexibility among the regions, but I think there's some opportunities for more foundational aspects of reform to be common across regions as well. As Commissioner French mentioned, there is a time dimension here. I think the solution sets that we'll be talking about there are fairly immediate opportunities, but I think there are fairly far-reaching, longer-term planning solutions I know that we'll be getting into. Ultimately, the system is not working efficiently now, and that those inefficiencies translate into costs. It's not just costs on the developers, but I find from my decades of experience that if there are inefficiencies in the systems, they ultimately have to be borne by the loads and a ratepayer interest. So it's important from a ratepayer perspective that we improve the efficiency of the interconnection process. That it means not only the process, but I think the payment structure that we'll be getting into in the afternoon is also implicated there. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Stanek?
I share Commissioner Allen's frustration. I think Chair Glick at the outset said the status quo is no longer tenable. And I'm frankly tired. I'm tired of receiving all these calls from generators who wish to develop new generation, but they can't interconnect. In the NARUC region, which is largely overlaid with PJM, we have 2,500 projects under study, and about a half of them have been in the queue since at least 2001. A lot of finger pointing going on between the developer, between the distribution utility, and between the RTO, where an RTO exists. The fact, like Commissioner Phillips said a few minutes ago, that 80% of these projects are effectively just clogging the queue with no hopes that they would ever be developed is something that we have to change. That's a problem statement that I think a lot of the state regulators see up front every day, just that frustration, the amount of dollars lost while waiting 300, 700, 1,000 days in the queue. I suspect our conversations today will start to address some of those solutions to get us out of this quagmire which we find ourselves in.
Chair Thomas.
Very briefly, while I agree with the past description of the problem in terms of lots of projects not being completed, we're beginning to see a new dynamic in which developers are valuing their queue position and telling us that if you don't do this, we're going to sell it to somebody else. Our regulated utilities are seeking to develop, and that's what they're hearing for vendors. So I agree with your saying that's been a problem in the past. I'm concerned that in solar development in my state that is beginning to change. Thank you.
Chair Nelson.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it quick because I agree with a lot of my colleagues, but I would just want to underscore the need for this and my appreciation for FERC looking into it, because just like Commissioner Thomas said, we've seen competition in queues, competition in order, land rights, people getting really creative about how valuable these like subtextual quantities are. Fixing this, I think, is going to be critical to kind of making sure that we don't have barriers to new entry. in our area as we see, at least in the New England region, a shifting and changing grid. So I appreciate this.
Does any other Chair French, you want to jump back in?
Just one more quick comment that some of my fellow commissioners made me consider there. And I think it's that maybe a word of hope that these queue backlogs may not actually be quite as bad as what they appear to be on some of these graphs. As folks have said, it's referred to as speculative projects, that a large percentage of these are speculative. That's probably not the word I use. I would say they're more placeholder projects that companies feel like they have to put in place because they're not sure what the cost of any particular interconnection is going to be. And so what that says to me is, because such a big percentage are these placeholder projects, that if we were able to create some good large amounts of backbone capacity on the transmission system, you may see and put it in the optimal place, you might actually see quite a bit of generation be able to be interconnected, and the backlogs could clear perhaps more quickly than we would think if we were able to move that along. Now, I know it's never easy to just snap your fingers and say backbone transmission. So I'm not suggesting that, but I do think that's a word of optimism, that if we can move through some large scale projects, the size of the queues and the graphs that we look at, they might look a little different.
Thank you. And any of the FERC commissioners on the task force want to add before we look at individual solutions? Okay, so I think that was a good discussion of what some of the issues are and whether we call them speculative projects or placeholder projects. We have a large queue, and obviously there's also a timing issue in terms of what we need to do now, and whether that's a transitional strategy until some of the longer term planning and regional transmission, et cetera, pick up. So why don't we move to the to our discussion now? So the way that we have this structured is there's 5 things that we're putting under the larger banner of better queue management that we wanted to talk about and get people's reaction to. And again, this was a list that was developed with FERC and NARUC staff, and the commissioners have seen this in earlier forms and gotten their feedback. So under better queue management, we want to look at whether these would be helpful either individually or jointly, tighter applicant requirements to enter and remain in the queue, clustering of applicants and areas for the purpose of studies, and upgrade costs, faster tracks for different generator categories, e.g. those that are in state solicitations or smaller resources. Is there a way to have different tracks for different types of projects? Tighter deadlines on transmission providers and RTOs, for instance, on the study side, and ways to think about minimizing reiterative studies. And then after we talk about each of those in sequence, we want to talk about the issue that a couple of you just raised, more proactive regional transmission planning and investment, including how to balance near-term and incremental needs with waiting for regional transmission development. And then if there's anything else at the end, we want to talk about each of these individually so we can kind of get deep into those. We have about 15 minutes for each of these. So we can kind of bat it back and forth. And then at the end, we'll circle back and ask you, of all of these, is there one or two that you think are most important? Are they all critically important? And we'll sort of end with that discussion. So First up will be the tighter applicant requirements to enter and remain in the queue. Should we think of the first ready, first serve type of approach? And we were going to start with Commissioner Duffley and then for Commissioner Christie.
So thank you. I'm going to discuss recent revisions to the generator interconnection standards as they relate to two North Carolina utility companies, Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. As I've previously stated, North Carolina has been a leader in the installation of utility scale solar, and beginning around the 2014 timeframe, the interconnection queue, which was a serial first in, first served process, began experiencing backlog issues and queue squatting issues. So the stakeholders within North Carolina, they worked together and they presented modifications to the procedures, including additional financial security requirements from the interconnection customers. While the revisions implemented to the North Carolina procedures in 2015 provided some relief and success, ultimately greater change was needed to deliver a more timely, predictable, and efficient interconnection process and to allocate the cost of network upgrades across multiple projects. The stakeholders continued discussions, and in late 2020 into 2021, further queue reforms were approved by the FERC and the North Carolina and South Carolina commissions. These reforms moved away from the serial study process to a first ready, first served cluster-based study process, providing order and planning with the hope of allowing interconnection of economically viable, commercially ready projects, while also clearing the queue. The new process is entitled the Definitive Interconnection System Impact Cluster Study Process, or DICES. And in this process, a window will open, an application window will open on January 1st through June every single year and take applications from the interconnection customers that meet readiness milestones. The process also allows the interconnection customer to provide increased financial security for certain readiness milestone requirements if the interconnection customer cannot meet those requirements. A transitional queue process was created to provide for an orderly transition from the serial process to establish a clear baseline for the first DICES. Late stage projects in the existing queue, the serial queue, had the option to move to a transitional serial process if the project met certain requirements. The remainder of the projects in the queue had the option to move to the transitional cluster study or voluntarily withdraw. Once the nomination time passed, those interconnection customers that were not within the transitional process, either the serial process or the cluster process, were automatically withdrawn. There were 32 projects that elected the transitional serial process. And as for the transitional cluster study, the phase one of that study has been completed. There were 268 projects eligible for that transitional cluster study. The projects that went into the first phase one included 58 projects and representing 4,880 megawatts. When the phase one study came back, the estimated upgrade costs were $620 million. The companies have started phase two study process. Many of the projects dropped out. However, there are still 22 projects and 575 megawatts that have proceeded to phase two. As we sit here today, the first DICES, the window from January to June, is currently open and closes at the end of June. This DICES process requires, and this is what the group wanted me to talk about, is it requires tighter applicant requirements to enter the process and to remain in the queue through the different study milestones. And so the revised procedures require, I'm going to talk about 4 items. One is increased site control requirements to enter the phase 1 study, which includes 100% site control over the land that the facility will be located, as well as 100% site control to the point of interconnection. The second new requirement is higher financial security and study costs to enter the phase 1 study. The third is more stringent readiness requirements. I'll give an example, such as an executed term sheet or the interconnection customers offering to sell its output through a resource solicitation process. And that's to meet the readiness milestone 1. These requirements become more stringent as you move through the different milestones. And if you cannot prove that readiness to enter into milestone 1, interconnection customer can provide additional financial security. And then the fourth new requirement is increasing the withdrawal penalties as the interconnection customer moves through each milestones. And so for the state, the North Carolina interconnection procedures, there are 4 milestones for those state projects. And for federal projects, they move through 5 milestones. So North Carolina is optimistic that these revisions will allow for the efficient interconnection of generation projects. And finally, I've heard from the Seabrook states as well as some RTOs like PJM, and they request that FERC allow queue reforms to move forward regionally without the disruption of possibly inconsistent NOPR requirements. So thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Commissioner Christie, and then we'll open it up for some other thoughts.
Okay. Well, first I want to congratulate Andrew French on the new baby. Congratulations, Andrew. And, I was talking to Andrew 2 or 3 weeks ago on a call about SPP, and I had to congratulate him about Kansas winning the National Basketball Championship. So it's been a great spring for you, Andrew. Great spring.
I've got a lot going on.
Yeah. Kim, sorry about Carolina, but you got all the way to the final game. So better my team did. Anyway, on queue reform, let's just put this in context just a little bit. And obviously we need queue reform, and we can talk about the details. I hear this narrative frequently that there's all this generation stacked up in the queues and it needs to be built. It's not getting built, it has to wait forever. And certainly there are problems, and there is generation that needs to be built. The Lawrence Berkeley study is very interesting. I really commend it to you. It's in your materials, and I was just reading it. It's cited in the Wall Street Journal today. What the Lawrence Berkeley study shows is there's actually more gigs in the queues nationally than all the installed capacity in the United States. Now think about that for a minute. More gigs in the queues than all the installed capacity in the United States. Now, unless you take the position that every single one of those gigawatts needs to be built of capacity, which you have to also take the position, if you do, that every single megawatt of installed capacity needs to be shut down, because that's the only way there's going to be room for it. So just keep all this into perspective. I think the message from that study, the Lawrence study, when Jason mentioned PJM, there's a lot more megawattage in the queues than the total installed capacity in PJM. So unless you want to shut it all down, there's just not going to be room for all of that. So how do you approach that? Well, in the non-RTOs, like Kim represents, that North Carolina, which is a non-RTO state, except for that little corner up in the Northeast, in the non-RTO states, it's largely a state issue. These are vertically integrated utilities, largely operating through IRPs, and the decision about what gets built, what doesn't get built, what gets through the queue or doesn't is really a state issue, largely in the non-RTOs through their resource generation, resource adequacy processes. In the RTOs is where you really have the problem, because these are supposed to be market driven. So which generating resources come out of the queue, get approved, and actually get built should be market driven. And I think what that leads to is the conclusion that a lot of the queue reforms that we're seeing from the RTOs that are already starting to bubble up, like the first ready, first serve. First ready, first serve is sort of a good rubric to put so many good reforms under. I interpret first ready, first served as meaning that a lot of the applications are just there basically as paper holders. And what you really ought to be doing in the RTOs is focusing on those who have the financial wherewithal and the business plan to actually build, if they get approved, to actually build. And I think the RTOs, I think as mentioned before, we're seeing from SPP, MISO, PJM, there's efforts in all the RTOs to try to incorporate some of these reforms. But I think that first ready, first served is really the good rubric for that, because again, it's got to be market driven in the RTOs. I mean, that's why the developers want to get into the RTOs so they can get access to the money in the markets. And so it should be market driven, and first ready, first serve is really a good rubric for a lot of specific details about who moves up in the queue and who actually gets approved. And there's a lot of details beneath that. But I think this whole thing needs to be kept in perspective about how a generating unit actually should move out of the queue, be approved, and actually get built. And it's different in non-RTOs where it's largely state driven than it's going to be in the RTOs. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, before we move on to talk about clustering and drill down that part of what Commissioner Duffley was talking about, if first ready, first served is a helpful rubric, as Commissioner Christie just said, and I think Commissioner Duffley gave an example on how you would, some of the things that you would go about to implement that kind of a rubric, with increased site control, increased readiness and term sheets, increased financial security, withdrawal penalties, anything going on in other states or regions along thinking through and implementing the first ready, first served rubric that should be mentioned before we go on and dive into clustering. So if I could see, we have a couple of minutes. Anybody want to add anything to that, or does anybody disagree with that? That that's a helpful rubric, and that those are the kind of places where we should be looking to flesh out a rubric like that. Chair Thomas, then Chair Scripps, then Chair Nelson.
I would be curious if Commissioner Duffley, are you deep enough in that process to be able to define how well it's working? Thank you.
No. So the first DICES opened up in January. So the first DICES will close at the end of June. We'll have a better idea probably first quarter of next year.
Okay. Chair Scripps, and then Chair Nelson, then we're going to move on to clustering.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering sort of what Commissioner French talked about earlier, in terms that these are largely symptoms of a much larger problem. And it seems that in this case, I go back to the old rap saying that all regulation is incentive regulation. In some ways, we're getting the system that we're encouraging here. When you talk to developers, they say that the length of the time to get through the queue processes encourages the speculative or placeholder nature of a lot of the projects, because if they had to wait until there was certainty in terms of the off-taker, for example, and then enter the queue today, they couldn't build that project until 2028 in a number of regions around the country. And so they've entered the queue sometimes 4 or 5 years ago, understanding that the queue process is what it is, so that as they move forward with the project, they have then the opportunity, when somebody comes to them and says, I need a project and I need a commercial operation date in 2023, they've got a project that can actually deliver that, instead of responding to that potential customer, utility or otherwise, that they'd love to do the project, but the queue being what it is, they can't actually bring that project online until 2028. So I'm concerned about adding too much in terms of the qualifications to enter or stay in a way that may actually exacerbate some of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of moving projects from sort of orientation and origination onto commercial operation. There is a danger here that sort of adding too much to what needs to be sort of there in terms of financing and everything else could ultimately delay projects that we're going to need, even if we don't know who the specific off-taker is today.
Thank you. Chair Nelson.
So I think at least the thing that Commissioner Christie highlights around there being more megawatts in the queue than generation. I mean, that is a symptom of the problem that we're trying to address here. I think, to share a personal anecdote, in trying to purchase a new car with the supply and chip shortages. I've got multiple refundable deposits in for multiple car manufacturers, hoping to get one in the next 6 to 9 months. That doesn't mean I'm going to buy 5 or 6 cars. I'm speculating. And I think having a speculative market does not necessarily make for an efficient market. And so I think what we're doing, or what we hope to do, is try to make sure that being in the queue means something. Because I think when we get to clustering, we talk about studies, that's a problem. And I think that in addition, so we got to figure out what the right balance there is. And then on the flip side, I think we'll get into it this afternoon around participant funding, but I think making sure we have a key developed process for how we're going to be treating participant funding will help to balance any stringency we put on queue reform as well.
Well, thank you. So we're just going to keep layering on things. Commissioner Duffy already introduced the idea of clustering studies, cluster studies. In that case, for folks that were already in the queue. But let's hear about more broadly what could clustering do, of clustering applicants or even clustering of certain areas. How could that help with the current queue issues? And to lead off, we were going to start with for Commissioner Phillips and then Chair Dutrell from Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. In addition to the requirements, and I agree with much of what was discussed by my colleagues just now, I have said before that we also need to consider cluster studies as a best practice. Almost all RTOs and ISOs have used a cluster approach for years, and PJM is currently working on a cluster proposal right now. Several transmission providers outside of the RTO regions have also started moving to a cluster approach in recent years, as we discussed a little bit. Clustering streamlines the queue process, which should help the queues keep up with increasing interconnection demand. Clustering can be more efficient because the transmission provider can group many projects together in one study instead of a separate study for each project. And if someone withdraws, the restudy process can oftentimes be quicker. CAISO's phased approach should also be considered to avoid restudies. And one benefit is that generators in the cluster can share the cost of network upgrades, which should help prevent cascading withdrawals. Lastly, I note that the CAISO, MISO, SPP, and ISO New England, they group projects based on proximity and electrical relevance in their cluster study processes. It's a mouthful. So with that, that's what I believe the benefits of clustering are, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Great. Chair Dutrell.
Good morning. The difficult part of going after FERC Commissioner Phillips is that he probably said a lot of what I was going to say. That's okay. It's my former NARUC colleague, and it's good to see him. So happy for him in his new position. I think you can see the passion behind the issue on clustering, as we've heard from different commissioners and of course from FERC Commissioner Phillips. The importance of a better queue management is definitely obvious in a lot of the conversations that we've seen. And I'm grateful for Commissioner Duffy and her explanation of what they are doing in North Carolina, which is a non-RTO area. We've also already heard about what other RTO areas are doing, and also highlighted by Commissioner Phillips what PJM is doing in my area, which is the PJM MAGRIC region. PJM's interconnection process reform task force has been working for a year to form stakeholder consensus around new rules to shorten the queue and to streamline the interconnection process to better accommodate today's generation projects. I believe that the RTO and the system planners are best positioned to structure interconnection rules for their individual regions, and that the prescriptive one-size-fits-all interconnection rules are not necessary. That being said, I think that FERC is in a position that they can encourage interconnection efficiencies throughout the country by promoting best-in-class processes, such as variations in ways to cluster projects. So that's my focus on clustering. The serial application process, which was designed around large megawatt projects, such as the fossil fuels that we see, coal, gas, but also with nuclear and hydro, is not working to facilitate the interconnection of the majority of projects in the queue today. And we've heard that. And because the majority of the projects are the smaller renewable projects. So to move those projects through the queue, the RTOs and the system planners may wish to look at things like the clustering of projects to form what I would call a megawatt floor for the minimum amount of megawatts that are in the queue. And then also look at clustering, because we know that the focus for clustering is, I would say, two goals, or let me back up. Also, not only to look at clustering in terms of forming a megawatt floor, but also look at clustering of projects to, regardless of size, maybe define it in a geographic regional area. And then clustering also could be based upon the time of application, which has been widely used in regions without additional layers of applicant requirements. Clustering, to me, has two goals to it, or twin goals, if I could say that, in terms of the interconnection queue. The first would be minimizing the study time by grouping similar projects, and I think we've heard a lot about that. And the second would be minimizing the first mover disadvantage by sharing costs among those resources that need the same upgrades. Still, the system planners know their regions best, and I've emphasized that before in my comments in other meetings where I talk about flexibility and letting the RTOs look at these issues. They do know, the system planners also know their regions best, and now they have acknowledged the severity of the backlogs, as we've heard from the comments, and will be able to determine the best approaches to shorten their queues and allow for generators to interconnect in a reasonable manner. So clustering of projects is not a new practice, as we keep talking about this, and the concept by itself is not necessarily a panacea. But as the generation resource mix continues to change, how interconnecting projects are clustered could make all the difference. And so I say leave it to the RTOs and the other system planners to determine how to effectuate the mechanics of queue reform in their regions, but perhaps give them guidance about the best-in-class practices in which to operate. Thank you.
Thank you, both commissioners. So we heard that clustering can do a few things. It can maybe help streamline and reduce the study time, and could reduce the reiterative study process, or make that reiterative process more efficient. That it could be done by geography, it could be done by time of application, it could be done again for new applicants coming into the queue, but it can also, as we heard from Commissioner Duffley, be done retroactively to folks that are already in the queue. And that it can also lead to share costs of upgrades, which we'll be talking more about cost allocation this afternoon, but that could also be quite a benefit. And then, as Chair Dutrell said, we should, FERC maybe should consider it as a best practice, but allow for regional flexibility. So I'd like to just hear from others before we move on. Is that how everyone feels about clustering? Do some people think clustering is not a good idea, or that there's another aspect of clustering that we should all be thinking about? Commissioner Allen.
Thanks. And I just have a few comments. I'd also like to call out the fact that clustering helps the regions identify what I'll call a backbone or kind of trunk facilities that provide, efficiencies in the system for the benefit ultimately of ratepayers. New England has been relying on clustering, and I'm told that that's going very well. They have a kind of a different approach than North Carolina, but I'll speak to that in a moment. I think there are different flavors, if you will, of clustering. There is kind of the reactive clustering, what I think of as reactive clustering, looking at the queue and identifying projects that have commonality in them, maybe by area, and that may kind of trigger a recognition that neither one can kind of pay for the facilities independently needed to bring the energy to the network, but if they can be combined, they might actually realize an economy of scale that will allow them to effectively participate. But that's a kind of a reactive mode. It's looking at the queue and looking what has kind of stood up. There's another approach which is more anticipatory. That I tend to think of the Texas approach. I think California may have used it, but it's recognizing that either by identifying regions that are relatively low cost regions and looking at the technologies of the day, you can kind of recognize and triangulate on regions that are ratepayer opportunities and can be developed. You can do that either by doing the analysis or by essentially trying to identify likely engaging some form of a solicitation to encourage developers to self-identify. I have to say that I like the open window, what I call an open window or open season approach that North Carolina Commissioner Duffley had mentioned. I think there are other approaches. I know in New England we have more of a serial approach. I'm told that it's working well. I happen to like the North Carolina approach, and I think other regions are looking toward that space of creating an open space for applications, and then kind of looking at the applications of the group for opportunities for combining in some sort of a cluster. As you point out, I think this also relates to cost recovery. There are different approaches there, and we'll be getting into that this afternoon, but there is a participant approach, and there is kind of a more sharing the burden or putting the burden on load. We can talk about that this afternoon.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have from the West, Commissioner LeVar, and then Commissioner Rechtschaffen.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments that Commissioner Christie made earlier about the differences between RTO and non-RTO regions. And I just wanted to very briefly point out that cluster studies is one of those issues that works differently, in my view, in those. In the West, where we have an IRP selected resource need, and then there's going to be a solicitation, and there's transparency, and everyone knows when the solicitation is coming, what the size of it's going to be. The cluster study process has, in my view at least, has contributed significantly to those planned solicitations based on IRPs. Again, where we also have state independent evaluators watching the process. So I just wanted to point out that that's one way it's been successful in the non-RTO areas. And because of that, I joined Commissioner Dutrell's comment that there's usefulness to best practices, but these best practices are going to operate differently in each RTO, and particularly between the RTO and non-RTO areas. Thank you.
Great. Commissioner?
Thank you. The CAISO has engaged in a cluster process, and I think it's very helpful and important for all the regions that have been articulated. And I think it is a best practice and should be promoted. I want to make just one point, which goes to your question a little bit earlier, Dr. Rob, about what do we do in as one reform versus others. Clustering is not a panacea. Just to give some context, last year in the CAISO, in one cluster in 2 weeks, there was 100 gigawatts of applications filed in a single window, which is 10 times the amount of authorized procurement. So clustering absolutely helps, including the proactive clustering that Commissioner Allen talked about, but it has to be accompanied by the other reforms that we're talking about.
Great, thank you. So I will move on to the next piece of a potential solution, which is whether there could be faster tracks for different generator categories. For instance, those in a state solicitation, or those that are smaller resources or more ready resources. And so, and I know a lot of states have been doing that when they're with their own DG interconnection standards. So we're going to hear first from, we've got both Chair Stanek and Chair Thomas, and then we'll go to Commissioner Christie from FERC.
Thanks, Dr. Rabb. In many respects, I think clustering and this fast track, fast lane process, they're Siamese twins. They're very different, but they have some similarities that lead to overall efficiencies. And one analogy that I think everybody is aware of is the TSA pre-check line, where if you provide the authority with some additional information and provide some additional payment, you could save a considerable amount of time waiting in the queue. And we've already seen some promise of this. I know MISO had a recently approved by FERC a proposal that would allow some of its projects to move through the queue faster if that project developer exposed itself to more risk. We all know that PJM later this month will be filing a proposal with FERC that will make the process somewhat quicker, maybe as quick as 450 days for projects. And that would cut down from an average of somewhere in about 700 days. But you mentioned state solicitations, and I think there are two proposals that are worthy of consideration because state regulators are issuing regulations or approving power purchase agreements for particular types of resources. And we know some of these resources, particularly in the mid-Atlantic, where a number of states have shown a preference for offshore wind, they have specific operation dates. They have site control by means of a lease from the federal government off of the outer continental shelf. And those paths align with the state approvals. So as opposed to the queue squatters or the queue speculators, we could pretty much bank on the fact that some of these resources will be with a high degree of certainty online. And perhaps those resources could take this fast lane, as PJM has termed their process, in order to move ahead a lot faster. A second option that we should be giving some recognition to is the fact that we have a large amount of retirements, particularly in the Northeast, but all across the country, in terms of generation, fossil generation that is exiting the market. And they will be giving up very valuable spots on the grid. We know that, for instance, the Oyster Creek generating station in New Jersey and the Indian River coal facility in Delaware will both be giving up in the near term, or has already given up, valuable injection points on the PJM system. And while an interconnection study will still be required to determine whether a new resource, and in both these cases, it's no secret that wind developers would like to plug in, perhaps the standard interconnection process would not be as arduous if we're using existing switchgear, existing substations behind the fence there. So accomplishing this transition, I think in a sort of predictable and controlled manner could avoid the immediate need for, number one, some deactivations or possibly expensive RMR agreements with generators that are exiting the market, but just taking advantage of the fact that these points have already been modeled. It shouldn't take 1,000 days or 4 years for somebody some generator to step into the shoes of an existing generator. And perhaps that's something we could consider. So some opening statements there. Thank you, Doctor.
Chair Thomas.
Thank you, sir. And I agree with certainly the study of milestones, financial milestones, site control milestones, reliability, fast lanes. And I agree with all these conceptually. And sometimes I worry that the group is not large enough to solve the problem. But while we work on those solutions, I also think that we need to be conscious that we not make this a game that only large players can play, that we not distort the market where it's only certain large entities that can play and others cannot. Now, you hope to hit it right in the middle. And I think the risk is greater of not solving the queue problem than mitigating those risks. As we seek to solve the queue problem, I think there ought to be metrics established so we can eyeball it. But we solve this problem, we're not creating the next problem that our standards limit competitive alternatives and faster, more agile, perhaps more entrepreneurial market entrants because we've imposed certain rules. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie. Shall we fast track certain generator categories?
Yeah, I had hit the button. First, let me say quickly on clustering. One reason I think that's a great idea is largely its benefit to cost sharing. I mean, we're going to talk about cost allocation later today, but allowing generator applicants to cluster and therefore share costs of interconnection, I think is one of the best aspects of clustering if it leads to cost sharing. I mean, I think that's the main as well, and that includes the other issues about doing the studies on the same track and that sort of thing. I really want to put a question out there to all the state regulators because I think it'd be very helpful to us here at FERC, and that is this. Please elaborate, and this is open to all the state regulators. Elaborate on how Jason mentioned Maryland doing a solicitation, New Jersey did a solicitation for offshore wind. Some of the states are actually doing solicitations. In other states, the LSEs are doing solicitations, but obviously subject to state regulation. How do you mesh, or how can the state solicitation process work with clustering, work with first ready, first served? In other words, there's obviously these should be meshing, and I just love to hear from the states. It seems like your solicitation process can help the first ready, first serve clustering, but how does that work? I mean, if you're going to do a solicitation, can you tee up clustering? Can you tee up cost sharing? Can you tee up the first ready, first served in terms of the financial wherewithal? How do you at the state level see the state solicitation process meshing with the rubric of first ready, first served?
So I'll get to that and let them answer that as they're also on this topic. I just wanted to know whether you had any reactions to whether a fast tracking is something that should be looked at and could have benefit.
I think it's a no-brainer. We ought to be doing it. I mean, I think that again, in the non-RTOs, the states largely are in control of that. Those are largely IRP states. We're talking RTOs really where this would have the biggest effect. And I think absolutely the RTOs ought to be looking at moving moving the projects that are ready to go, that have the financial wherewithal. I know Ted's concerned about, is it only a game for the big guys? The reality is financing is going to be available to whoever can justify it. So clearly the projects that are ready to go should not have to wait for those that are basically speculative.
Okay, so we'll open it up for others who want to add to what we've heard so far on the fast track, and also Commissioner Christie's specific question about how the state solicitation process would mesh with all of this. So we've got Commissioner Nelson, then Commissioner Duffley, then Chair Click.
Sure. So I think with fast tracking, certainly state-sponsored resources have, in the state's eyes, something that we want to get online, right? Especially if it's a public policy project and the individual state's paying for it. But I do think that these things all kind of crash into each other. So, the authority to issue a state-based contract I'll speak just for Massachusetts now, has been enabled by our legislature. And our legislature is not experts in queue reforms or clustering studies or FERC proceedings. And so the sophistication by which what they're putting in legislation is around things that you're trying to achieve, right? Reducing costs and making sure that we're getting a certain quality of energy and making sure that we're getting clean energy in some cases and reliability or winter delivery. All that said, I think that the issue that you're seeing is that these processes don't necessarily, fit in like Lego pieces to each other. And I think that's where having some understanding or flexibility is needed. I think that's one of the reasons why the 6 states in New England in the regional level, have talked about market reforms to talk about ways we can incorporate some clean energy, maybe in a different type of mechanism to try to take advantage of some of those regional efficiencies. All that said, I do think that clustering has distinct advantages because everyone knows that when you're building something, when you're getting the permitting, when you're doing the siting processes, you do not want to do that on a one-off individual basis. You want to do it in groups. So I think Commissioner Christie said cost is an issue. I think siting and permitting is also equally a large issue that, you want to go through those processes and do everything that has to go in there once. So having a bigger cluster study is also an advantage there to help these things get fast-tracked when they're in the queue.
Great. Commissioner Duffley, then Chair Glick.
Thank you. So Commissioner Christie does bring up a good point, and I think that will be the next challenge within North Carolina is aligning the solicitation process with the DICES process. And I can give an example. So the DICES request window for 2022 is open from January 1st to June 29th. Then we also have in North Carolina, the utilities have their third tranche of a competitive procurement of mainly solar plus battery. And there's a 596 megawatt target for that third tranche, and that starts on May 15th. And then the utilities have also filed with the commission for a 2022 solar procurement of 700 megawatt minimum, and that's pending for the commission. So I think that putting these pieces together, like Chair Nelson stated, is going to be the next iteration in moving forward to getting these projects interconnected. I will go back to Chair Thomas that the changes in our interconnection standards were modeled after Colorado Public Service Company. And so they are further down the road. So Chair Thomas, if you're interested in seeing the success that company has had, you may want to look at those filings. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Glick.
Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion. I think in general, there's a lot of consensus that we need to speed up the process. And, it's like clustering, first ready, first served, financial security, site control, all those types of things we need to take a look at. I'm going to express a little bit of concern with regard to doing it by generator category or, fast tracking certain generator categories or another, because we have a responsibility under the Federal Power Act to ensure there's not undue discrimination. Now, there could be discrimination if it's warranted, if the categories aren't the same, but it does, I want to express some concern because I think if we start promoting a process where one type of generation or one type of generation that actually is different than another generator, and it might come across as discriminatory, and might some courts might actually not approve that particular approach. So I think we need to focus on expediting the process. But if we do it by different categories, I think we might run into some trouble.
And would Chair Glick, just before we move on, would that also apply to resources that have made it through a state solicitation process and been selected? And also, would that also apply to size, or is it just generator types of generation?
So it seems to me that, I don't know about size, but it seems to me that one of the things that we could require is some sort of demonstration of viability, right? And obviously, if you're chosen in a state solicitation, that or if you win an RFP contract, that makes some sense. I think to the extent, again, some of the smaller resources, for instance, and I think Chair Thomas raises a very good point. We need to think about that. But if you start saying smaller resources have a separate category and might get some expedited approval, that actually might, I think that might come across as discriminatory.
Great, thanks. We have Chair Scripps, then Chair Thomas, and then we're going to layer on the next level here.
Excellent. So I think I agree with the fast tracking for projects that are ready, including those solicited in a state process or utility process where there's sort of a clear path. I think it's just a sequencing issue, because often you need to be in the queue in some regards in order to participate, given some of the timelines, again, from earlier. And I think this is one of the issues that probably goes to the issue raised by Commissioner Christie in terms of if we built everything that was in the queue. I think for a lot of those projects, you've got 7 projects. We know that one's going to be built. We don't know necessarily which one is going to be built at this point, but providing some certainty that that the project that's ultimately selected has a path to completion in a reasonable time, I think would go a long way. I think the other part of that is sort of what certainty we're talking about. The certainty on timing is, I think, really important, but the certainty on costs is at least as important. And I think there are issues where you think that you're ready to go, but if you don't find out the ultimate cost for the upgrades that are required until the tail end, as Commissioner Phillips described earlier, I mean, if it's 50+% of the total project cost is just the interconnection, that can pretty quickly kill the economics of moving forward. So I think the certainty of timing and a fast track process, but I think with that has to go certainty of cost, or at least a greater degree of certainty of cost, so that generators or prospective generators have a better sense of whether they actually are ready to go through the rest of the process.
Thank you. Chair Thomas?
Commissioner Chris raises an interesting point that actually I wish I had thought of that a couple of years ago. But one thing that's interesting about all that is our state procurement process is in danger of getting by how fast stuff is moving. We have one development that our utility wants to purchase, and we were told, do it by the end of June, or we're going to sell it to somebody else, because they're deep enough in the queue process. And what we're seeing is, and this vendor didn't participate in our state procurement process because they said, well, that takes too long, we can move faster. So that's another, and it's an emerging thing, and I'm not even sure completely how it impacts the queue stuff, but in terms of thinking about tying it to the state procurement process, our state procurement process is struggling to keep up with how fast things are moving. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Allen, if you have something quickly, because we're a little behind, go ahead.
Yeah, this is quick. I just, in part, it's a response to Chair Glick. There's also the opportunity to actually tie the fast track to other markets. So in New England, we kind of link it to the forward capacity market as a mechanism for essentially streamlining the permitting process. That's all.
Great, thank you. So we've talked about some various things on kind of the applicant side, right? Tighter applicant requirements, first ready, clustering. But what about on the RTO transmission provider side? Should we be looking at things like tighter deadlines for things like studies? So Commissioner Clements was going to go first, and then Chair Scripps.
Thank you, Dr. Rob, and thank you for the great conversation so far today and the input into these important issues. I want to make a couple of contextual points that feed into answering this question briefly. And first is, it's an interesting conversation about perspectives on why people are in the queue and why there's a lot of speculation going on. You know, of course, some are wild cowboy speculators. I've been supporting those types of developers for a long time in my career. And then there's the set that Chairman Scripps just described, which might have, you know, 6 queue positions, pretty good sense that they're going to be able to finance this project once they figure out where those specific costs fall out. And then you've got those kind of players with a signed offer from a big corporate customer is ready to go. But whatever the case, that we've got now 1,400 megawatts of generation plus storage in the queue, this is our future supply, right? This is what will serve customers going forward, because no matter what the driver is for new generation, they have to come onto the transmission system and they have to go through a queue process. So if we cut it in half, we cut that list in half, we're still talking about our future supply, right? And the way that we're going to get those resources, 90% of which are fuel-free, low-cost resources to customers. The second point is that, and we'll talk about this more this afternoon, so maybe this is just a placeholder, but most cases, costs flow through to customers. I think Commissioner Allen and Commissioner Thomas said this morning. Whether or not it's paid for in the sign of, you know, being priced into a contract, whether or not it's paid for right up front in time as kind of network upgrades, ultimately customers, regular customers, are paying for these costs at some point, and that's something I think that's really important to keep in mind. And then third, and more specific to this question, one solution hasn't been able to get at the problem. So I'm appreciating this conversation around, you know, first ready, first served, around clustering, around the other readiness requirements that Commissioner Duffley was describing and have been discussed. I'm intrigued by this fast track option and how we can get at that in a way that allows for facilitation per kind of some of Chair Stanek comments and stays within the bounds that Chairman Glick identified. But so far, none of these have gotten at the problem. And so if you think about strengthening the requirements that interconnection customers, that the project sponsors have to satisfy coming into the to the queue, it's also important to think about whether or not the transmission owners and the transmission providers are meeting their obligations. So if you only put in half the puzzle pieces, you don't solve the puzzle, right? There's a remaining set. I think I'll give it to Chairman Stanek for his TSA analogy, because I think that's really important. That's, you know, one thing you've done to help facilitate your travel more quickly. But, you know, pre-COVID, when I traveled a lot as a somewhat entitled business traveler, nothing would just frustrate me more or annoy me more than being in the TSA line while the regular line was just flying through and going faster because there were too many people who had taken that step. And I think that's a really good example of why you have to fit all of these puzzle pieces together. And so it gets to this question of what's the responsibility of the transmission provider? And as we know, for many reasons, transmission providers and RTOs are not able to make their study deadlines. PJM reported to us that in 2021, 99% of facility studies were completed late per their tariff deadline. FERC has reported that interconnection requests were satisfied after the fact. So it's a nationwide problem, and I am also processing and appreciating Commissioner LeVar's comment on the idea that it's not the same in RTOs and not. But a lot of the good practices we're seeing emerging around the country and that the Commission has considered lately are coming from non-RTO regions and could be applied across the board. Transmission requires per FERC standards are required to make reasonable efforts. That's the standard. So interconnection customers facing study delays have little recourse when a transmission provider misses its deadline, because the reasonable effort standards is not a particularly high bar. At the same time, the interconnection customers facing stringent deadlines and requirements and these things that we might strengthen and can strengthen to stay in the queue and to avoid getting kicked out of the queue. And not, you know, as a third of 4 kids, the first question I ask in most of my family gatherings is this fair? Is this fair? Is this how we should do it? Do we need to make some sort of modification to the reasonable standards, reasonable effort standard? Are there other ways to ensure that transmission providers and RTOs, when it is in their control, to meet their deadlines, to be better incentivized to meet study deadlines? What tools do we have? You know, the record shows various things. One of them is a penalty structure. Of course, if we were going to impose some sort of penalty structure for the failure to produce timely studies, we'd have to think about the specifics, you know, force majeure exemptions, waivers, amount of the penalty, what we would use the penalty for, when the penalty would start. Penalties aren't the only option, and they're not a mutually exclusive option. So I'd love to hear from you all what else we can alleviate some of these challenges, perhaps by incenting the devotion of more resources to interconnection, which is a conversation that's been happening. You know, hiring more staff, investing in software. We could do additional public reporting requirements. You know, what about a scorecard relative to performance? What other tools are you seeing out there across the spectrum of ways to incentivize on-time performance on the transmission provider side to fill out this puzzle, if you will? And so with that, I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. Chair Scripps.
Thanks. So it seems like there's two pieces to this question. And as Commissioner LeVar noted, and to their credit, a number of RTOs have actually announced efforts to accelerate their queue timelines, which I think is an important step in the right direction. And I also agree with Commissioner Brown-Dutrell that RTO system planners often know their systems best and are best placed to determine the process around queue reforms that sort of best fit the unique qualities of the region. I think in many cases, the most effective solutions may come from RTOs to reform their own processes, and that FERC's role may be more limited around guidance or encouragement or baselines with flexibility for RTOs to then implement. But I think FERC may have a larger role to play in issues that cross RTO boundaries, particularly around cross-RTO affected system studies, where individual RTOs have limited control in the studies and the study timelines conducted by neighboring RTOs. Or to put it another way, absent significantly greater certainty around the timing of affected system studies, it's unclear to me how individual RTOs can actually meet their stated goals around accelerated queue timelines. These cross-RTO affected system studies are a growing source of delay and cost uncertainty for interconnection customers, both in terms of just the timelines involved and the difficulty in pinning those down, but also, as I mentioned earlier, around costs that can come out of these affected system studies that have the ability to destroy project economics. And so again, while many of the most effective solutions on individual interconnection queue process may come from the individual RTOs themselves, fully addressing these cross-RTO issues are inherently beyond any one RTO or ISO's ability to sort of fully control. Of course, this isn't a new issue for FERC. In 2018, the Commission's Technical Conference on Affected System Studies resulted in an order that was issued in September 19th that required RTOs to improve transparency into affected system processes. But at that time, the Commission declined to open a generic proceeding to address broader affected systems coordination issues. We saw in the filings from MISO, SPP, and PJM that were done in 2019 and 2020, compliance with the mandated improvements, the delays have continued to persist, and often due to the underlying issues that were brought to light in that technical conference. Namely, each RTO's process and study times are different and tailored to their region. And FERC found in 2019 that alignment of generator interconnection processes across the RTOs to be unnecessary and unworkable at that time. To take one example, the MISO PJM compliance filing included more detail into joint operating agreements, tariffs, and business practices manual improvements into how the RTOs currently conduct affected system studies, but stopped short of making any sweeping changes to align their interconnection processes, modeling standards, affected system queue priority, and other issues. And this was an issue that was flagged by the organization of MISO states, which has an overlap, not perfect, but with the MARC region that I represent, where we said, as seen throughout various comments in the recent FERC technical conference related to this issue, coordination of affected system studies may be an opportunity for consistency that has wide stakeholder support. Inconsistency in this area can create problems with interconnection queues. While it is still important to respect regional components, such as modeling and interconnection processes, there may be an opportunity to create a general framework that would be applicable to each of MISO's seams. Affected system studies could be better coordinated through the existing joint operating agreements and further customized for each seam if necessary, end quote. And so given the challenges involved, it may be time to revisit the Commission's 2019 decision not to initiate a proceeding to better coordinate affected system studies. Specifically, there may be an opportunity to create a general framework that would be consistent across RTO seams. Affected system studies could be better coordinated through the existing joint operating agreements and further customized for each seam if necessary. It's worth noting that this process may have different implications across different seams. Some seams may have extensive affected system studies delays, while others may not. However, we expect the affected system study process to become increasingly critical as more renewable resources come online in renewable rich areas and transmission capacity becomes ever more scarce. So again, while it's clear that system planners know their individual systems best, this is a place where FERC has a unique role to play in standardizing cross-RTO processes and better enable the individual RTOs to meet the more aggressive and accelerated queue timelines that they're targeting.
Great, thanks. So I think we've heard that study deadlines are routinely not being met. There's many reasons for that. One of them is the affected system studies, cross-regional studies, that process could be improved. And then Commissioner Clements mentioned a few different other areas to look at, think about whether the standard itself needs to change about making reasonable efforts. And do we need any kind of a penalty structure, and what would be the unintended potential consequences of that, or report card? So what do other people think about this area, and what are some potential solutions on the RTO transmission owner side? We've got Chair Thomas up.
Thank you. I agree word for word with what Commissioner Scripps just said. I think the most effective use of in terms of balance to flexibility and the need for progress, the most effective place that FERC can operate is in the area where you have two RTOs and your real issue is getting them on the same page. I think that FERC should start gently and move towards less gentle as needed, and examine whether the proceeding that Commissioner Scripps mentioned was the first gentle step. But with respect to Commissioner Clements, I need to think more in terms of whether the types of measures she referenced are more of a flexibility or whether those are more necessary to be insisted on. I'll have to ponder that one. Thank you.
Commissioner Duffy.
So with respect to the reasonable effort standard, North Carolina has kept that standard, but when we made revisions in 2015, we did, and again, that's with the North Carolina interconnection procedures, we did encourage adding staff, and we did require reporting and to report on a quarter, I believe it's a quarterly basis. So we did add those two types of requirements, or the encouragement and then the requirement. However, I will say with respect to the new process that North Carolina, or at least DEC and DEP, have moved to, I think that they will be on a better track to meet deadlines because all of the noise has been cleared away. It's upon the interconnection customer to determine whether they are ready to enter the window for 2022 or enter the window in 2023. So there'll be a smaller potentially universe of projects that are before the utility, and that they can use their resources on discrete functions and having that discrete process. So again, maybe Public Service Commission of Colorado has already seen this in their process.
Thank you all. We're going to move on to the issue of how you could minimize reiterative studies, and probably some of the pieces to that we've already talked about in terms of cluster studying and trying to minimize people that are in the queue that are not real projects. But why don't we go ahead? We're going to hear from Chair Nelson and then Chair Glick on this.
Thank you. So, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the fact that the elements that need to be fixed to worry about getting rid of speculation inside of the cluster studies that are going to happen. You know, I think the key thing I want to say here is that customers are going to be better off financially if we decrease the uncertainty on how these processes go. We've seen firsthand in Massachusetts when projects are trying to come online, they get grouped into a cluster study. There just creates this uncertainty around the cost it's going to take them to interconnect. And so I think the cycle of that is damaging to both generators and to customers. I think the goal is to improve the efficiency by reducing that uncertainty. If you'll stick with me, I kind of think this analogy is kind of going to the supermarket. You got a recipe at home. You said, here's what I want to cook. You go to the supermarket, you get to the register, you bought all the ingredients, but you have no idea how much it's going to cost. And then they start ringing it up and you say, well, I can't afford this ingredient. That doesn't fit within my budget. So now you have to go home, get a new recipe and start it all over again. It's a very frustrating process. And in this analogy, the customers are my hangry family at home waiting for me to cook dinner. I think the whole point of doing the reiterative studies is you're trying to come up with an approximation for how you're going to distribute the costs and what the costs are going to be. Coming up with a better way, both what we're going to talk about this afternoon with participant funding that adds some certainty, and also on the front end of making sure that the right people are in the queue are going to be two critical cornerstones of trying to make sure that we're not going to have the wrong people in there. And so that when we get to the end, we don't just hit the reset button and say, well, 30% of people dropped out and now we have to add in new participants and do it all over again. There's times when that's going to be completely appropriate and the costs are going to be so high and it's going to be too prohibitive that we kind of want to say that whole area should get moved on from in terms of individual generators paying for the upgrade. But I think we're seeing it predominantly on the distributed generation side. And I would say that, an individual generator, individual power plant might see this a little bit less. But in terms of distributed generation, we're seeing lots of different providers in a very large geographical area having that impact hit multiple different pieces of that technology. And so, we'll go into some of the solutions, I think, when we get into the participant funding. But I just want to highlight that's our concern. And we think that it's wasting both the efficiencies the market can provide, the economic incentives they can provide, but also timing. And in terms of building things, I think timing is the element here we don't discuss enough because I think we are trying to build things in a relatively rapid succession and to wait an extra, 3 to 5 years, not just the normal queue times, but add on top of that is just that much more damaging to the financial viability of the projects that are trying to become economically viable.
Chair Glick.
Next thing, I was thinking about Chair Nelson's previous analogy about cars, right? And this is the example of why in the car situation, if the person ahead of him drops out, let's say he's in line to get a Tesla, and the person ahead of him drops out, it's good for him. In this particular case, if the person ahead of you drops out, we have to restudy the matter. That takes a long time. It's going to cost more, and it actually messes up the process further. And so I think it's something that obviously is a problem, and I think will be addressed by many of the changes we talked about. It. There's one other area that I think is very important, and that is RTO resources. There are RTOs have a limited number of folks that work on this. They're very smart, very good engineers, but it takes a long time to go through the process of doing these studies and modeling, preparing the models and so on. When someone drops out, they got to do this all over again. And they only have a certain number of resources. Now, one of the issues, when Commissioner Clements and Commissioner Scripps were talking about some of the changes we have to make from the RTO perspective, one of the things we may need to take a look at is do they have enough resources, or do we need to incentivize RTOs to have the staff on hand to be able to do these studies. But the more we have these reiterative studies over and over again, we have a finite set of resources, and it's going to take longer and longer because of that. So I think again the solution here is clear: is to expedite the process. We have to figure out a way, as we expedite the process, not to incentivize dropout after dropout after dropout, to the extent that once the study's done, because then again that just further delays the process.
Thank you. So other thoughts on specifically how to minimize reiterative studies? It sounds like I'm guessing everybody thinks it's not a bad idea, but how do you do it? Any best practices emerging in your region? Chair French.
Thanks. And I don't have necessarily a best practice yet, but I want to endorse kind of everything I just heard, specifically what Commissioner Nelson was saying about cost certainty. I mean, when I talk to the generator developer community, there's essentially two big complaints. One is cost certainty, and then one is the amount of cost sharing. But I actually think the cost certainty is the much bigger issue. And it's frankly the one I have much more sympathy for and much more willingness to start to address. I mean, I've got some concerns with how much cost we want load to take on up front. But as far as cost certainty, everyone knows in private industry that is an essential element of being able to sell a product, is to know what your inputs are so you can market it. And that is something we have to figure out. And I don't want to get into debating, the topics we're going to talk about this afternoon, but I think not necessarily laying out, okay, this is the specific dollar amount you're going to pay, but laying out what is the process by which we're going to assess and calculate the costs that are going to flow to you, something more predictable than what we have now, something that perhaps they could even perform their own analysis and have a rough idea of where they're going to end up. I think that's going to be essential. And so I'm not saying anything new that Commissioner Nelson hasn't said, but I'll just say that is absolutely something I hear over and over and over, is much more certainty in the process, so folks can understand where they're going to end up. And I absolutely agree with that 100%.
Chair Thomas.
There's a chicken and an egg problem with respect to the restudying and the cost. The biggest reason people drop out of the queue is the cost. They see the cost number, they drop out, then you have to restudy. It also changes the share of costs for everybody else. And that's a hard one to solve. I wish I had a solution on that one. I'm just pointing out this one more problem in our pile of problems.
Commissioner Duffley.
You asked about best practices, and I think one of the best practices of the new system that DEP and DEC have implemented is the increase of withdrawal penalties as the interconnection moves through the process. So the first phase 1 study, I think it's a good thing that some people may drop out, because those people may have projects that are not efficient projects and maybe should never be built. But the ones that continue to remain and go to the next study up to the facilities study, those projects will remain. And through this process, with the increasing penalties as you enter into the next milestone, will reduce, hopefully, any type of late dropout of a cluster that really would impact. And with those increasing penalties and the financial security that's being provided by the interconnection customers, if they drop out, at least with state queued projects, that can be used for the upgrades for the remaining members within that cluster. FERC has a little bit different law. So the FERC jurisdictional rules state that it cannot be used for the upgrades, but it can be used and pushed forward for future studies.
Anybody else want to comment on this? That was very specific way to try and reduce reiterative studies and reduce the impact of reiterative studies. Commissioner Allen?
Yeah, I just wanted to call out another kind of facet of this. What I have seen is some of the reforms that have taken place in regions is that they're increasingly creating what I think of as kind of a triage framework. That is, you have opportunities to engage in feasibility studies. You don't necessarily have to, but as you go through those kind of earlier stage studies, the intensive one is the system impact study. As you go through the process, you can actually learn things that help you to say, oh, gee, I'm not going to go for the big nut, the later studies that are, going to tell me the full story. I can actually drop out. So it creates a form of self-selection and triage as you kind of pay sequentially for each stage of the process. And I think that's an element of the overall challenge that is making progress in some regions.
Great, thank you, everybody. So we're going to move from queue management to planning, and this has been mentioned by Chair French and others during the course of the conversation. So the question, the area is whether more proactive regional transmission planning, investment, and planning for multiple needs, and breaking down the silos, as I think you were talking about in your first meeting, including how to balance near-term incremental needs with waiting for regional transmission development. How can this be useful in dealing with the queue issues, both in the short and the long run? And we were going to start here with FERC Chair Glick, and then hear from Commissioner Allen and Chair French.
So thanks again. And I would want to say the discussion this morning so far, what I've taken out of it is there's a lot of consensus that we need to make significant changes to the queue process to expedite it. Now, it may be that more so towards RTOs or towards other regions, or maybe we need to provide some room for RTOs to have some flexibility. All those things we need to think through. But I think in general, there's a lot of support for short-term actions that would hopefully expedite the process. But the bigger problem still remains, and again, we're going to talk about funding network upgrades later on, but the bigger problem remains that, and we saw it in the discussions we've had on transmission planning, that increasingly, you see all these studies out there, increasingly transmission development's being done through the network upgrade process as opposed to your typical regional transmission planning process. And what that does clearly, and Commissioner French mentioned it just a few minutes ago, and others have as well, is what it does is it increases the cost, it increases uncertainty, it increases the cost of the generator interconnection process. It causes people to drop out, as we just talked about, and it further delays the interconnection process. But to the extent we can have a more anticipatory longer-term transmission planning process that takes into account some of these issues, and a lot of the transmission is built as it should be through the transmission planning process, I think what that does is it will certainly result in a much more expedited interconnection process, again, because there will be less uncertainty and there won't be as many concerns about some of the cost uncertainties, as well as the when you get to the end of the process, having to pay a significant amount of upgrades. So as everyone knows, we have a NOPR out there. I'll put a plug in for it again. Obviously, we want to hear everybody's comments, but I think to the extent we can make some progress, some significant progress, and I think we can on transmission planning, the result will be over the medium and longer terms, a much better interconnection process as well.
Commissioner Allen and Chair French.
Thanks. So I'll just, I was also going to reference the notice of proposed rulemaking that just came out, because I think this does tie directly into that. I think we need to be more holistic in our long-term kind of regional planning. I think a facet of that is It relates to the interconnection queue, but it really relates to kind of longer term thinking about the kinds of resources that are likely to show up in the interconnection queue, not just those that have already appeared in the interconnection queue, but we can reasonably anticipate will be showing up at a later time. And I think we need to recognize that this also relates to the conversation we're going to have in the afternoon about participant funding and, you know, what's fair and directly assigning costs to cost causes. There's going to be additional costs that potentially, if we're truly being holistic and anticipatory about the impact of the new interconnecting resources, it means that there's going to be a cost impact. And how do you kind of assign the cost of a big major infrastructure improvement, a trunk line or backbone system that might be effectively utilized by interconnecting generators? And I think there are very sensible pathways to allocating costs to, you know, the entire class of interconnecting generators, recognizing that cost causation is largely the driving force behind the participant funding mechanism, the prevailing mechanism for recovering costs related to interconnection. We can apply that same principle on to the joint and common cost elements that might be associated. I think those costs are important to consider because I think there's a growing body of evidence, especially from PJM and MISO, that we can actually interconnect much more capacity going forward if we do it in a very anticipatory, a long-term planning framework than on a serial or even a cluster framework, cluster by cluster framework that is the prevailing paradigm.
Well,
thank you.
Commissioner Allen and Chair Glick basically said exactly what I had planned to say in my remarks. But you know what? I'm going to go ahead and say what I came here to say anyway. And that's just, you know, as I said before, the root cause of queue backlogs and long wait times was that we didn't recognize the coming intense demand for new energy resources, particularly those remote renewable fuel savings resources. And we didn't sufficiently plan to build the transmission needed to integrate those resources over the last 5 to 10 years. And as Chair Glick said, the Commission recognized this in its recent NOPR, and it's proposing longer term planning to accommodate this new demand. And I want to call out a couple specific sections because I maybe haven't gotten through every single element of the NOPR. I'm gonna talk about a couple paragraphs at the beginning, and that's paragraph 25. The Commission found the current planning approach was problematic and needed reform, and they said, I quote, "We are concerned that the absence of sufficiently long-term comprehensive transmission planning processes appears to be resulting in piecemeal transmission expansion to address relatively near-term transmission needs. We're concerned that continuing with the status quo approach may cause public utility transmission providers to undertake relatively inefficient investments in transmission infrastructure, the costs of which are ultimately recovered through Commission jurisdictional rates." And more importantly, in the next paragraph, they tied this suboptimal planning to the current queue-based processes, stating expansion of the high voltage transmission system is apparently increasingly occurring outside the regional transmission planning process, and again, in a piecemeal fashion through other avenues, such as the generator interconnection process, primarily in response to individual or a small cluster of interconnection requests, rather than through the regional transmission planning and cost allocation processes. I could not agree with those comments anymore. And so since we know what the root cause is, and I think we can identify what the long-term sustainable solution is. And yes, there is queue reform and queue management efforts that we need to take in the interim, but I think we can reduce the cost burden on generators when needed upgrades are also create clear and calculable benefits to load. But the actual solution in the long term isn't queue reform. It's how we plan transmission in the long term. And so given the findings from the Commission and its NOPR, again, I don't think the long-term best approach for consumers is simply queue reform or backlog mitigation. I think some interim efforts may be needed in the short term, but those shouldn't be permanent. The long-term solution is long-range planning to create more capacity on our systems. This should be aimed at harvesting the lowest cost optimal resources from resource-rich areas and then moving it most efficiently to load centers. And I look at something like the CREZ lines in Texas or the MISO MVP projects. Those are the types of things we should be pursuing. We should not continue simply with a queue-based one-by-one method of hooking up generators wherever they happen to request interconnection, and then inefficiently further meshing that resource into the local grid, whether or not any load exists in that local zone. That approach, which is basically what we have now, will not build the grid of the future. The grid of the future will be built by planning transmission for new generation alongside other needs like reliability, economics, and resiliency. If we break down those silos and create a holistic planning process, we can find the most optimal solutions to meet all needs, and we can do that at the lowest cost for the customers. In fact, I do want to shout out that that is what SPP is trying to do right now. We have a consolidated planning process task force, and I have a concern, and I want to make sure that any short-term interim efforts or reforms don't get in the way of those longer-term efforts to do what we need to do in the long term. So main points: plan holistically and proactively to meet demand for changing resource mix, keep costs reasonable for all stakeholders. The biggest question right now is how to balance the short and long-term needs. How do we find an interim solution that doesn't perpetuate the status quo to the detriment of the long-term solutions and efforts? Thanks.
Thank you. So let's take a few more comments on this notion that really straightening out the long-term planning and building of transmission is the best long-term solution, at least for the queue issues we're seeing today. Chair Nelson, then Commissioner Rechtschaffen, and then Chair Thomas.
Sure, and I'll recognize from my experience being a commissioner that you have to take bites at these things. To echo some of the comments, though, I think one of the goals of this process, I think, should be trying to de-silo how these things are separated out, because I do think that when we're looking at both problems with queues, problems with cost allocation, problems with planning, they are all interrelated with the common goal of creating a more market-based, more economically viable system that is going to enable more transmission and create a broader set of benefits for customers. So I think, I'm really looking forward to the afternoon's conversation. But I think when we get to a place where we're looking at what the overarching goals for this NOPR and future versions of NOPR is, we should recognize that I think one of the goals is also a broader discussion around de-siloing, how to ensure that different transmission planning and cost allocation things are interrelated, and they are leading to higher degrees of reliability, higher degrees of economic certainty. And you see that certainly in the queue reform, right? I think that's one of the things where the rubber kind of hits the road, and you're looking at trying to balancing engineering studies with economic practices, along with making sure that the actual system has been properly upgraded. So I appreciate all the comments made. I'll try to keep mine a little bit shorter, since I think Commissioner French hit on quite a number of issues. So thank you.
Commissioner Rechtschaffen.
I agree with what Commissioner Nelson said and Commissioner French's comments. I strongly agree with those comments, as well as those from Chair Glick and what Chair French said at the very start, that queue backlog is a symptom of a larger problem with the lack of long-term regional planning. We need to plan more holistically, more, if you call it proactively or anticipatorily. It'll be much less costly. And I commend FERC for leaning in so strongly on the need for transmission planning reform. And one of the interesting things in the NOPR discussing ways to move away from interconnection-based planning is how the NOPR proposes addressing issues of multiple interconnection requests that we know are needed, but they drop out over time. And FERC's proposal that those should be studied as part of a regional transmission planning process. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't think I'm quibbling with Chair French, but I do think that even though queue reform is not the long-term solution, we still need it very much. The pace of development is astonishing, as Chair Thomas noted. There's a lot of backlog and dysfunction right now. The long-term planning process will unfold over a period of 5 or 10 years, and there's a lot to be done in the interim. So I don't want to minimize. I'm not suggesting that Chair French said this, but I just want to emphasize that queue reform remains a very important complement to those long-term planning efforts that we need to engage in. I think, as I indicated before, we'll need multiple paths in the short term. The accelerated process for projects that are ready and prioritizing interconnection requests that are linked to state procurement or state policy goals are two particular paths that are promising. And finally, I want to reflect on something that has been said multiple times before, but that I want to reiterate. Chair LeVar and I were at a CREPC YRAB meeting where we solicited comments from other Western states. And one of the very specific things they asked us to relay back to FERC is that there are a lot of processes happening at the state level that should be allowed to flower, and FERC should provide flexibility for those to continue.
Thank you. Chair Thomas and then Chair Dutrell.
Thanks, sir. I agree with what Commissioner French said in terms of not letting the little elements of queue reform block the big picture, but then I also agree with what Commissioner Rechtschaffen just said. See you in 7 years doesn't cut the mustard. I think we need to do both. We need to do the long term, where the ultimate solution is, but at the same time, you know, we need the smaller incremental steps to get us there to our later solution. I also think, and I respectfully disagree with Commissioner Danley's view with respect to the ANOPR, mostly because of the interconnection. The interconnection stuff is tied to the transmission stuff. If it were just the long-term transmission stuff, perhaps we should leave the RTOs out there working on that as they try to do. But the RTOs have been working on these interconnection issues, and we don't have a solution yet. You know, when I came in, I remember hearing about queue reform for the first time, and the next year there was another queue reform, and they, you know, it was third, fourth, and then they quit. It was almost like it became an annual thing. In 7 or 8 attempts at queue reform in the last 7 or 8 years, we're not getting there, and this ties to the long-term transmission. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Brown and Chair LeVar.
I just want to quickly agree with what my colleagues have said in terms of queue reform and regional transmission planning. Both are very important. And just to remind those that are taking part of this call, that was part of NARUC's comments. They recommended that integrating transmission planning with interconnection. So it's definitely something that we've discussed and put comments on the record. So thank you.
Commissioner LeVar, Chair LeVar, sorry.
Thanks. I just want to mention that I think Commissioner Clement's comments earlier about consequences, to me, is a pretty intuitive, important step as you're looking at queue reform. She was talking about it specifically on missing deadlines, but I would say it could be applicable to any missed tariff requirements or missed tariff obligations. You know, an intuitive first place to look as we're looking at reform is what are the appropriate consequences to the transmission providers when they don't comply with their tariffs. And Commissioner Clements pointed out some of the problems with fines. Fines aren't always the best consequence, but there needs to be some clear, predictable consequence for transmission providers not meeting their obligations. And if that area can be improved, it seems to me that's the first step in queue reform. Not necessarily, obviously, transmission planning encompasses everything we're talking about on this task force, but consequences for not meeting tariffs seems to me a good first step in queue reform specifically.
Great. So we're just going to take I know everybody's kind of chomping at the bit to get to cost allocation in the afternoon, but I want to just take 5 minutes before we break for lunch and allow any kind of final thoughts. It seems like we're hearing two major things this morning. One is that both more proactive regional transmission planning investment and queue management are both needed to deal with the queuing issues over time. And second, I think what we're hearing is we talked about 5 different queue management strategies. And I think what we're hearing is that each one of them could be an important piece of the puzzle. But I guess I wanted a chance for anybody to either thinks differently or feels that, 2 or 3 of those queue management things are really much more important than the other 2, and that's where we should get started. So just any kind of closing thoughts on this before we take a lunch break. And love to hear from some of the FERC commissioners too, on having listened to your states. Go ahead, Commissioner Allen and Chair Stanek.
Yeah, I'll reiterate what people have said along the way, which is I think all of the above is appropriate. I haven't gone through the process of kind of figuring out what is highest priority. I actually think the regions and the states have been doing a good job on especially clustering, and I think there's an added dimension to clustering that could be considered as we had kind of alluded in our earlier comments. But I do feel like there's no reason to kind of just choose between the groupings. I think it's it's a growing issue, and we need to give attention probably to all the promising avenues that have been identified, and probably others that the laboratories of the regions and the states will help to percolate at a later stage.
And I was going to say something very similar, that we don't have to make Sophie's choice between 1, 3, or 5 of these. They each have their pros and cons. And if we hew to having more flexibility in the process, we should probably have all 5 options on the table. I would only say that uncertainty, which we've heard a lot, the time associated with uncertainty, the costs associated with uncertainty, cannot be allowed to infect any of these new reforms. If we build them from the ground up, we need to do our best to build them to protect against uncertainty creeping in.
Thank you both. Anybody else want to offer some final thoughts on this for now before we break for lunch? Yes, Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see me. I've lost some of my connection, but I want to just highlight something I'm hearing, which is 2 parts, and they're not necessarily in tension with each other. One is that we have seen a lot of reforms, incremental reforms and bigger reforms come before the commission in recent times. And some of those, as the one Commissioner Duffley started with, are just in their first phase, right? So we're just learning about how much success we can have, or the improvements that can be made, and the lessons learned and refinement. Also, there have been attempts at incremental reform, and to hear, Commissioner Thomas's point and Commissioner Rechtschaffen's point, and I think others made this, apologies for missing it, is it hasn't worked. So far, the incremental reforms, FERC's last attempt through Order 845 in what I think was 2018, hasn't worked, and maybe Commissioner Brown-Dutrell made this point as well. So I think I'm hearing flexibility around what set of these things we need to do. Don't screw up the good stuff that's happening, and also a recognition that it's not working yet. So we do need to take on some level of reform, and I don't know if that's a fair characterization from your perspectives, but I'm glad to keep those things in my head as we go into the afternoon.
Thank you. Anybody else? Seeing none, hopefully, Commissioner Allen, you have one more closing thought?
Yeah, I had to insert something, and I didn't want to wait for the afternoon. It concerns that the last topic that we covered. There's an intersection between interconnection and the longer term planning efforts. And I wanted to make the point that, it's important in my mind to highlight the fact that we shouldn't just be reactive there. It shouldn't just be thinking in terms of longer term planning relative to what's in the queue or what has appeared in the queue in the past. I think we should be truly anticipatory and visionary in addressing future queue problems or anticipating future queue problems that might arise, not just reacting to what's in the queue.
Great, thank you. So with that, we are going to break until 1:15, and then we'll start on the afternoon right at 1:15. So I hope everybody has a good lunch break, and I'm sorry you're not eating together. We're ready to begin. Thank you. Well, I hope everybody had a good lunch and some further thoughts about this morning, and felt like we had a productive conversation this morning. And now we'll move on to the much less controversial issue about funding and cost allocation. If we could, Tanya, if you're back, if you could put this slide up. I want to just describe how we're going to go about this. Great. So the goal of this afternoon's session is for us to discuss whether or not, and if so, what changes are needed to allocate the cost of network upgrades in a manner that's cost effective and aligned with the benefits to interconnecting generators and to load or the transmission system. And we'll do this in similarly in two pieces. One is we just want to spend a little time up front thinking about the challenges, just so that, again, we're all trying to solve the same or similar problems. And then we'll look at alternative approaches and discuss the strengths and weaknesses as well as preferences among really four different alternatives, not necessarily mutually exclusive in all cases, but one on one end would be that participants are responsible for 100% of the costs, at least in the RTOs and ISOs. On the other end of the spectrum, that's load responsible for 100% of the costs for certain types of upgrades. And in the middle, we're going to explore several different forms of participant load cost sharing. And then finally, we want to touch on one special case, which is a form of participant funding, if you will, which is generator subscription approaches. So I'll introduce each of those four in a little more detail. We're going to again go through each of those individually, and then allows for some time at the end to figure out what we've collectively learned together and where you come down on these options. So we're going to start with a discussion of the challenges. And if we want to just put that back up for a moment, Tanya, one moment, because I want to actually read it to everybody so we're all calibrated. So it's recognizing that currently the interconnection generators cover most, if not all, the cost to interconnect to the transmission system in the RTOs and ISOs. What are the challenges, if any, with this approach? And specifically, we want you to reflect back on our discussions from the last task force meeting, as well as the recently released NOPR, which has a principle on cost allocation needing to be commensurate approximately with the full range of benefits. So how does that jive with the principle that's been mainly guiding cost allocation within the interconnection queue, that the sort of the incremental but for costs are covered by the interconnection generators? So we're going to start off with just to talk about the challenges. We have 15 to 20 minutes for that. And we're going to start with FERC Commissioner Clements and State Michigan Chair Scripps to lead us off, and then hopefully you'll all join in. Commissioner Clements, I know we're having some issues connecting you earlier. Hopefully you're on and ready to go.
I think so. Thank you. This one should be no big deal, so we'll probably wrap up a little early. And it's hard to, I think we've already had some conversation this morning about what the challenges are, and it's what one person's challenge is another person's treasure. I mean, I think in the comments I'm making, it's not a wholly objective perspective. It's a perspective of kind of experiencing the record in this ANOPR docket relative to these issues. So I might be jumping a little bit ahead to some of the specific proposals, but I look forward to your comments. On cost allocation, the approaches for interconnection are intended to follow well understood cost causation principles. And in practice, of course, they vary from region to region to some degree. In general, to the extent that current approaches land lumpy and large payment obligations on whichever interconnection customer is unlucky enough to be at the front of the line when the music stops, right? When the system runs out of room, then the approach risks failing to assign payments, to all of those who benefit from the investment, whether it be previous or future interconnection customers or customers more broadly from a reliability and economic perspective. We've talked about how this lotto or casino effect, as people have called it, of this current approach is a contributing factor to the cycle of projects dropping out of the queue, causing restudies and delay, causing more costs, and having it happen again. I appreciated the comments this morning on the temporal nature of the problem. So better proactive long-term planning should do some of the work here over time in ensuring that we have sufficient transmission capacity to meet future demand. And until then, I think some of the nuts and bolts reforms we were talking about this morning should also help to ease the problem. To me, the core issue of who should pay for the new system investment will remain both before and after the results of the hopeful results of long-term planning kick in. So when it comes to what is the solution, I don't view the issue as all or nothing, and I don't have the perfect solution in mind to contribute to the conversation. I don't think the solution is going from all to nothing. I don't think that while interconnection customers currently pay all of the needed upgrade costs, the solution should be jumping to having them pay nothing. It doesn't jive with our cost allocation principles. I've never had a project sponsor suggest to me that they're unwilling to pay their fair share. And I've also never had a transmission provider suggest to me that in all or even in most cases, the whole of network upgrades benefits accrue only to the interconnection customer or customers paying for them. So with that, I want to hear your perspectives on how moving away from 100% participant funding to more of a middle ground may contribute to alleviating this queue logjam, improve allegiance to this cost causation principles, and provide this elusive certainty that we're talking about. We have some interesting ideas in the ANOPR record about ways to elevate the sophistication of how we do cost allocation for interconnection to make responsibility for the cost hew closer to the likely division of the benefits that any given investment may provide. Generally, these ideas support some subset generally these ideas suppose that some subset of proposed upgrades benefit only the customers asking for them, while others benefit a greater group of people through reliability or congestion relief or otherwise. On the one more comment before I open it up, on the certainty front that we've been discussing, in my office, we've been batting around this idea that better coordination between planning and interconnection could get us even as far as the point where we could set up something like a per megawatt fee at least, within geographic or temporal parameters to provide that height of certainty. We're not there today. And I think we should be aiming that high. We should be aiming for simplicity in the midst of all this complexity. So I appreciate that views are certainly varied. Not everyone shares the perspective I just did. And for those of you who do have a different view on this idea of trying to find a middle ground, I'm interested in that perspective and the nuances of how sticking with the current approach to participant funding is consistent with our cost causation principles and the goals of breaking through this interconnection queue jam. And so with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Rob.
Thank you. Chair Scripps.
Thank you. Just confirming you can hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I just had my internet quit, so I missed most of what Commissioner Clement said. So apologies if I'm repeating anything. And I find myself in the unfortunate position of having to follow her for the second time today. So the issue of costs that should be borne by interconnecting customers is increasingly coming up in discussions around transmission planning and queue reform. Obviously, it's what we're talking about here today and connected with the ANOPR. And in addition, I've also been involved in discussions taking place between MISO and SPP related to the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study Process, or JTIQ, and in forward-looking conversations taking place at the MISO Regional Criteria and Benefits Working Group related to cost allocation of future tranches of LRTP projects. And I know that these discussions are taking place in other regions as well. From my view, one key challenge is to keep in mind the broader context surrounding issues of generator contributions and participant funding and work to avoid siloing this issue, because it really does connect with a number of other pieces. And specifically, I'd argue that participant funding reform should go hand in hand with interconnection queue reforms. And of course, the best way to fully address the many interlocking and overlapping issues involved is through consolidated transmission planning, where each of the elements driving transmission projects can be assessed, consistent with the principle included in the OMS cost allocation principles, that generators and load can be considered cost causers, beneficiaries, or both, and should be allocated costs accordingly. Harkening back to discussions from our last task force meeting, it seems clear that where the transmission system is frequently congested or at full capacity, participant-funded network upgrades may provide broader system-wide benefits that are not reflected in the cost allocation. And as the ANOPR pointed out, this can create a free rider problem. In addition, as we discussed earlier in today's discussion, the participant funding model is by and large reactive to individual first-to-cause interconnection requests, and such a process does not incentivize the comprehensive transmission planning that would more efficiently account for future anticipated interconnection requests, as a number of my fellow commissioners have noted. I'd also note that NARUC's ANOPR comments describe potential alternatives and modifications to the first-to-cause cost allocation problem that are worthy of consideration. I'm confident that we'll unpack a number of those as we get into the discussion. And then finally, I think perhaps the most significant challenge to the current model is that it relies on funding from interconnecting generators to cover a significant portion of the costs of what are essentially backbone transmission projects needed to maintain system-wide reliability. There's been a lot of discussion of the drivers behind the changing resource mix, and it's an important discussion with real consequences on how costs tied to our regional transmission needs should be allocated. Indeed, one of the benefits of the participant funding model is that it sends an effective price signal to interconnection customers to site their projects where it is of least cost to interconnect to the transmission system. And without such siting price signals, loads will unreasonably be forced to pay for network upgrade costs based on inefficient project siting discussions. This is undoubtedly true, but it also presupposes that the grid we have is the grid we need, and all that's missing is price signals for efficient siting and new generation. And I'm increasingly unconvinced that that is the case, as we've seen with outages in Texas and the South and other places in recent years. I think we're at a point where the changing resource mix has already triggered a number of challenges, and that the solutions required are effectively transmission solutions. So it's not that we're building out base or backbone transmission projects in order to simply accommodate generators, but really to keep the lights on. And whether we continue to allocate a disproportionate share of the cost to interconnecting generators in order to fulfill this reliability imperative, I'm not convinced that the current model strikes the right balance. So I think those are some of the challenges. I'm sure that we'll get into more discussion around each of them as we go forward this afternoon.
Thank you both for your very thoughtful introduction to the complex challenges surrounding this issue. I just want to give others a chance before we really jump into exploring the different options from the status quo to other arrangements, for others to just say, you know, from your region, from your state, how are you seeing these challenges kind of play out and manifest themselves, and what problems is it causing from where you sit? Commissioner Allen and then Chair Thomas.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate a couple points that were made first by Commissioner Clements, and then what Commissioner French had mentioned earlier, which is it's the lumpy and large payment challenge that is part of that. Commissioner French referred to it as cost certainty is kind of the biggest thing that is out there. I appreciate it. I think that both of them, Commissioner Scripps had a link. It created a stronger linkage between the cost allocation issues that we're confronting in the afternoon and the queue problems that we have had in this morning's session. I think there's a very strong linkage. I think Commissioner Clements had actually alluded to a path that I'd like to kind of cover later in the discussion, but I think it helps to potentially address some of the problems that they've highlighted in addition to those that were mentioned, the free ridership problem. Thank you.
Chair Thomas and then Chair French.
Thank you. I'd like to get into a little more detail on something that Commissioner Scripps mentioned, this JTIQ, the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study. The first thing to note about this is it's joint between MISO and RT and SPP. Both Commissioner Scripps and I had referenced the idea of RTOs needing to work together. But this is an instance where they have worked together. The second notable point about this is a transmission of planning approach to the interconnection problem, the driver of where the projects are with the need for interconnection. The project as a whole has a 0.6 benefit ratio, which nobody really wants to bite off on that. This illustrates a bunch of the thing with this. First of all, that there is a 0.6 benefit ratio, in my view, demonstrates broader system benefits. It's not a zero. Where do you get the other 0.6 if you want a 1.2 to have a little margin of error? Well, perhaps that's participant funding. But if you take the two of them together, I'm sure that this approach is cheaper than doing this one-off as upgrades funded through the existing system. But the other 0.6 also presents challenges. How do we know when that's there? How do we know that it's going to be fully subscribed? Who bears the risk of all of the participant funding side not showing up? Because there's time issues. That risk is exacerbated by the fact that some RTOs have a policy whereby a transmission owner can step in and rate base a interconnected project where the developer pays the rate base to the TO, which creates a risk of default. What happens if the TO defaults? Who bears that risk? And of course, this solution, but it also a potential solution, but also demonstrates how complex the problem is. The cost allocation with this is extraordinarily difficult. You have to divide your SPP versus MISO benefits. You have the shared transmission benefits that have to be allocated in both. And then you have the allocation issues related to what I guess would be the developer funded portion to get somewhere where the benefits exceed the cost. So I think the JTIQ thing offers a lot of lessons and demonstrates that this is a hard problem, but perhaps also illuminates where you need to go to find a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair French, then Commissioner Phillips, and then Chair Nelson.
Thanks. And I'll be really quick because but I just want to make a couple points because I think you may later think I'm being a bit of a downer on some of the specific proposals. And so I want to say up front, I am a believer that when we make certain high voltage upgrades as part of the GI process, there are real benefits that flow to load. And so I do want to explore some of these cost sharing principles, particularly as they relate to the higher voltage backbone type of upgrades. So I want to get that out of the way up front, that I see some value in that. But I also want to make one point, which I don't think is going to fit neatly within the rest of this discussion. But I think it's important because, as was mentioned, the overarching goal is to get more toward a consolidated planning process where we aren't looking at these needs in silos. And I want to say that the cost sharing is not just a one-way street. This is not just about getting load to pay more or to chip in more of the cost to help interconnect generators. It's to try to find the most accurate cost allocation over all of our investments. And I know one discussion we've had within the Southwest Power Pool is that if we can't get to a consolidated planning process, then as we develop projects, we can look at each one and see what are the benefits to each the generator and to load for those, and we can be more accurately assigning. Because right now what we're doing is it's a time-based cost allocation. If the GI process solves first, the cost is allocated to a GI customer. If the regional planning process comes up with a big backbone project, well, then the generators can all basically free ride on that for a few years, and very little upgrades are necessary. They don't have to pay anything for them. And that's the situation we were in for maybe the last 10 years before we ran out of capacity. So just want to make the point that ultimately we need to get to a more holistic, consolidated planning process so we can find more accurate cost allocations for each project. It's not just about asking load to share in more costs. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you. I just want to put on the table one point that has been made to me several times, and this really is just as a general legal matter. If load is benefiting but not paying, perhaps we should look into whether this violates the 7 circuits ruling that costs must be allocated roughly commensurate with benefits. One of the things I said, and one of the reasons why I supported the recent NOPR, is that where we have deficiencies in our policies, I think we have an obligation to address it. To the extent that this legal argument carries weight, I think that's something we should consider.
Thank you. Chair Nelson.
Yeah, and I think you're going to hear a lot of echoes of those comments that Commissioner Phillips just brought up, is that we're trying to balance the benefits and the load. In ISO New England's region, a lot of the new projects in the ISO New England queue are projects that are being driven by state policy and funded by state resources. I think that the question I always bring up is, how do we balance that? Because I think you want an efficient market to run. You want to be able to ensure that the way we're developing this is fair, but not just for the one person right next in line, but also thinking about how is this sustainable over a long period of time, right? It's such a balancing act, but transmission, you can compare it to highways in a certain way where, we don't construct highways based on the principle that, the Amazon facility or the UPS facility is putting in a load center to move produce around. I think the benefits flow broadly depending on the size and the scale of something. Now, should they contribute? Yes. That there's no doubt that there should be a contribution, but trying to figure out how to balance that commensurate with the load, I think, is probably the evolving position that I'm hoping this group kind of coalesces around.
Great. These are all good opening opening remarks to kind of ground us a little bit before we then roll up our sleeves and look at each option. Anybody else want to add anything, or having heard all of this, have a different view? Then the kind of willingness to explore how a beneficiary pays kind of principle fits into this area, and this kind of historic way that interconnection generators were covering most of the or all of the costs, particularly in RTOs. Okay, then let's roll up our sleeves and get into the different areas. And I think what we'd like to do is really, we'll take each one again in turn and think through what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of that approach, as well as to hear from you among your preferences of the broad brush alternatives kind of as we go, and then we'll circle back and look across all of them again at the end. So the first one is having participants responsible for 100% of the upgrade costs in the RTOs and ISOs. And so we're going to start on that with Chair Dutrell and Commissioner Doffley, and then from FERC, Commissioner Christie.
Thank you. I was chuckling at our comments in the beginning about this being the, and I know it was a joke, this being the easier part of the meeting. So participant funding and the RTO and the 100% responsibility of the generator in terms of interconnecting, it is something that is not necessarily a general consensus within the MACRC region. So let me just emphasize that up front. We are such a diverse RTO, as well as we talked about diversity within the different areas of the country. So my comments are more along the lines of what Pennsylvania, and then also just a reminder in terms of the general comments that NARUC put on the record in terms of in the ANOPR when we were talking about participant funding. So in my comments for participant funding, I generally think that the commission should protect customers from paying for transmission costs based upon speculative estimates. And we talked about that, generalized or speculative estimates of transmission benefits. And the participant funding model is based on the tried and true rate-making principle of cost causation. And I just wanted to highlight what I believe its benefits include, and that would be promoting efficient siting of generation project, as well as allowing parties that are best positioned to control the interconnection costs to bear the cost. It also allows to keep investment risk with the merchant generators. And many states, and I will point to Pennsylvania, deregulated to take those risks off of captive customers. And that was in exchange for taking on market risk, and the generators were relieved of regulatory burdens. Participant funding allows various drivers for new generation, including access to market, the federal, state, local, and corporate goals, as well as in-state procurement requirements. And that would be some of their RPS policies that we've seen across the country in different states. And then finally, just to point out stranded transmission costs for generation resources that do not interconnect with the grid. That would be something that I would highlight in terms of benefits we see in terms of participant funding. And I would open up for further discussion.
Thank you, Chair, for making the case. We're going to hear from Commissioner Doffley.
Okay, thank you. The CBRC states agree with most all of the points that Commissioner Dutrell has made, and we request that the Commissioner strongly consider the filed NARUC comments, as well as many other comments in the record stating that participant funding should remain, including but not limited to the 2 market monitors, the large public power council, industrial customer organizations, and other transmission customers. So realistically, there's a strong consensus for the support of this model. And I'd also like to touch on the discussion that the group had prior to lunch, which discussed transmission planning and long-term transmission planning. While I was listening to the discussion, it made me realize that if the commission changes participant funding, it's allowing for the opposite of transmission planning. Those two seem to be an antithesis of each other. It's allowing an individual generator to site in a spot that's most economically beneficial to that generator, as opposed to what is best and most cost efficient for the system as a whole. And the generator is doing nothing wrong. It's just a market principle that would play out. So removing participant funding increases the patchwork build out that many at the end of the first session want to avoid. So having load, which is basically ultimately customers pay for a percentage of merchant transmission bill, has the effect of requiring costs to customers for transmission that they may not want nor need. And I think it was at the last task force meeting, the dinner analogy came up. So using the dinner analogy that we've heard, potentially if a person's ordering a bottle of wine, knows that the bottle is going to be split 4 ways, they may not care as much as to the price of the bottle, and may opt for a more expensive bottle than if the person knew that the full cost of the bottle was going to be laid upon him or her. Thus thrusting a more expensive bottle of wine onto someone that does not even want a glass of wine at dinner. So to justify this on a cost benefit basis would require assigning value to externalities, and it could place unquantifiably high cost with really no cost containment or no limit, as well as the shifting the risk that we heard onto utility customers. So it may be prudent to not make changes all at once, but to look at incremental steps when we're discussing changes to a system that provides an essential service. I mean, that is why utility regulation was created in the first place. It was to provide for the orderly and most efficient way to build out a reliable system, making sure that it was not being overbuilt or the wrong line might be being built at the expense of the ratepayer.
Thank you. Commissioner Christie.
Yeah, let me get started. I had to hit the buttons. Can you hear me, Jonathan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I don't think the video is on, but there it is. Well, anyway, not that that's that's the least necessary part. But enjoyed listening to Commissioner Dutrell. Enjoyed listening to Commissioner Duffley. All I can say is what she said twice with regard to both of them. I would say, Kim, I would substitute gin for wine in my case, but great analogy. And with that, I have nothing to add. You both were great, and I agree with you.
Okay, so I think they both very well made the argument for the traditional participant funding to continue. Let's hear reactions from other commissioners, both at state and FERC, about the participant funding model. Yes, Chair French.
Thank you. This is where I said I'm going to be a bit of a downer for those wanting wholesale reversal of participant funding. But I will start by saying I think there is a growing body of evidence that for the higher voltage, bigger backbone projects, those do provide regional benefits. And to the extent we have studies and evidence to back it up, that there are benefits flowing to the region, then I do want to consider reforms on those. But let me give a couple of concrete examples of why I think it would be a little dangerous to go completely away from a participant funding model, or to share too much costs. And that's, I guess you often hear the phrase thrown around, well, load eventually pays. And so, what does it really matter how we assign costs at front, because load always pays. And I've got to tell you, I cringe every time I hear that, because load does not always demand the same thing. And I think that's the point Commissioner Duffley was trying to make. And let me give a couple concrete examples here. For example, in Kansas, you may see a wind farm developed in, say, Ford County near Dodge City, and it might be developed to meet the demand of Amazon or Facebook to meet corporate sustainability goals, and that's great. We want to help them meet that demand, but then, depending on the cost allocation model, that wind farm may drive some, maybe say 115 upgrade costs, so lower voltage upgrade costs. And depending on the cost allocation, that may fall to the local zone. And so you have folks in Dodge City paying for upgrades caused solely by a wind farm built for a particular need that they didn't necessarily ask for. And I think that's kind of a dangerous situation, where you want to make sure that you don't have costs falling on a local zone where you can't identify the benefits. Similarly, we aren't a retail choice state, but we from time to time do allow things like a sleeved purchase power agreement, where a large industrial customer could get the full output of a wind farm or a solar facility and enjoy directly the economic and environmental benefits of that low cost facility. But if there is a bunch of cost sharing, the upgrade costs necessary to the grid to make that deliverable, energy deliverable, could get spread to other ratepayers who aren't directly receiving the benefits of that facility. And so there are some concrete examples why I would be concerned with perhaps too much sharing, particularly as it relates to those lower voltage upgrade costs, things below 300 kV. I think that would be very concerning to see a substantial amount of those upgrades fall on local zones that are hosting those, when you have particular load or particular generators serving that load that benefit from that. So I think there is a case to be made that some piece of this, or we shouldn't make wholesale reforms or reversals on participant costs being 100% responsible in some cases.
Thank you. And obviously one of the three examples that we're looking at for the cost allocation is one that's based on voltage. So we'll get to that in a moment. But let's hear from other reactions. Commissioner Allen and Chair Glick.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that participant funding is there's participant funding and there's participant funding. I mean, it's a cost causation kind of principle, but it's a cost causation principle from the vantage of what I see as a kind of a problematic queue framework. If you were to rather look at maybe portions of the grid that need upgrades from the broader long-term planning frame, you would actually come up with a different answer if the question was, what is the causal element of interconnecting generators that should be appropriately allocated back to them? That is, even if I were a supporter of participant funding, and frankly, I broadly am, because in my mind, it reflects cost causation. I would rather look at it through the frame of a centralized long-term planning framework rather than a serial or a queue-based next in line framework which inevitably leads to the problems that we're trying to solve of cost uncertainty and lumpiness and large payments. I don't think you can get away from those. And those are essentially a part of the root cause set of concerns that we're trying to address. Thank you.
Chair Glick.
I think you have to start a little bit, look at this from a historical perspective. So FERC originally said, with regard to network upgrades and cost allocation, that to the extent that generators pay for the network upgrades, they get credited back with some transmission rights. And then we said, subsequent to that, well, with regard to RTOs, if you come in and ask for a variance, we'll probably give you one under certain conditions, and most RTOs, if not all of them, have that variance. And I think the concern there is so this is really a concern mostly on the RTO side. Secondly, and I want to pick up where Commissioner Phillips left off, because he's exactly right. You know, we have to follow the law, and the law is determined by a lot of judicial precedent. In this case, we have several cases which make it very clear that you allocate costs based on benefits. Beneficiaries pay. And I think that this cost causation, if you go back and look at the cases, the ICC cases, the Seventh Circuit cases, which Commissioner Phillips mentioned, and there's a NARUC case as well, the courts have essentially said cost causation really is benefits, and you have to look at who benefits in terms of who pays. And I think Commissioner French is exactly right, and we'll get to this in one of your subsequent questions about should you go full bore one way or the other way, 100% one way or the other way. And I think that's probably not the right solution, because you have to look at really who benefits. But I think there is the concern that I have is that it's the opposite of the so-called the dinner example that was the dinner analogy that was provided, because I think the concern is in many cases, people are, as I said earlier, transmission is being built through the network upgrade process, and then the costs are being borne by the generator in that case, and other beneficiaries, and in many cases, some cases load, benefiting significantly and not paying a dime. And so I think there's an incentive to push all that today towards the transmission upgrade process as opposed to the normal transmission planning process. And obviously that's why we need to fix that. But I want to make the point is that I think that the extent that we continue on with the 100% participant funding in the RTOs without crediting opportunities that there are elsewhere, I think we are running the risk of being afoul of what the courts have been telling us with regard to cost allocation.
Chair Nelson, and then Chair Stanek.
And I'll try to keep it quick, because I think that we're getting there. You know, if generators are coming out of the system to make a profit, they have to pay money to have that right. I think that that's dead on, that an element of participant funding is appropriate to keep. And I think what we're trying to do is balance it a little bit. And we're loving the dinner analogy, so I'm going to go right back to it, because why not? But, you know, maybe they don't pay for the alcohol, but in those particular instances where I've gone to dinner with people, we don't take the taxes and separate those out. We don't take the tip and separate those out. So there's ways to balance the fairness of how these things go that I do think can be part of a productive discussion coming up after this.
I was going to reflect on what Chair Nelson said the last time he spoke about 10 minutes ago. This is an evolving issue. I think we all agree that the beneficiary pays principle reigns supreme. I think in the past 20 years, when participant funding, the large benefit of that was to discipline efficient siting of the generator. We did not at that time have all of the metrics and tools now, whether it be distribution factor, load flows, in order to determine beneficiary pays. I would be very concerned if there were only speculative benefits assigned to customers in my state. But to the extent there are quantifiable benefits, to the extent we could have a market efficiency study that reveals that there's a cost benefit, a net benefit to load, then I would agree with Chair Nelson. There should be some type of evolution in our thinking. And the NARUC comments did not 100% shut the door on a shift from participant funding, but recognize that there may be avenues of reform. At the end of the day, this is a tough issue. Chair French said maybe not all load pays at the end, but I think it's clear customers in the end will largely shoulder lots of the costs, whether it be generator borne or load borne. The customers oftentimes pay, if not 100%, large majority. Thank you.
So with that as a foundation about talking about the challenges and exploring a little bit about the benefits of a participant funding approach and also some of the potential shortcomings, we wanted to turn the bulk of our attention right now to talk about if there was going to be some kind of a cost sharing, how could it be done in a rational, reasonable way that is consistent with beneficiary policy. And so I'm just going to say we're going to look at we'll start with kind of the overall idea, which we've already started talking about in this, about using a participant load cost sharing approach. And then we're going to take a look at 3 specific examples of the way to do that came out in some of the comments through the ANOPR that were flagged by NARUC in particular for things that we want to talk about today. So one of them we've already just talked about a little bit about having cost sharing based on some sort of a voltage line. Another one, which is that their payment is for upgrades up to a certain point in the system, say up to the substation, and that load covers upgrades on the other side. Or there was also a proposal to use something known as a transfer distribution factor. So we have about 50 minutes to talk about all this. The way that we're going to do it is Commissioner Phillips and Chair LeVar and Chair Thomas are going to start us off. And then before we open it up, Chair Nelson's just going to talk a little bit more about those 3 approaches that I just mentioned as examples, and then we'll just open it up for conversation about this entire idea of splitting and whether if any of those 3 are more or less attractive, or whether somebody has other ideas too of kind of a fair way of splitting the costs if you go down that route. So let's start with Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you. I want to start off by saying pretty much what is the obvious. It appears that the cost of network upgrades might not currently be allocated commensurate with benefits, as required by the 7th Circuit and some of the other decisions that have been mentioned, in particular by Chairman Glick. With that in mind, I think the easy thing is just say, we're going to maintain 100% participant funding. I mean, I know me as a former state regulator, and I agree with a lot of my state colleagues. Nobody wants to shift costs to customers. But I think the legal question still remains whether or not we are allocating costs commensurate with benefits. So with that in mind, I believe that cost sharing might actually be more cost effective for consumers overall, because it could provide some incentive for TOs to proactively plan and build the optimal transmission lines in the first place. If you look at CAISO, for example, the TOs are required to refund the generator for upgrade costs within 5 years after the commercial operation date. In MISO, generators pay 90% and the load pays 10% for the network upgrades above 345 kV. It could also provide some financial certainty and predictability to generators. which could help clear out some of these speculative or placeholder requests in the queue and the restudy problems that we talked about a little earlier. And so I'm interested in considering whether there are any appropriate cutoffs or thresholds to determine which upgrades are actually interconnection related and that generators should cover the cost. I agree. Getting rid of participant funding completely does not appear to be persuasive to me. Currently, it seems though that the interconnection studies often use a very low threshold for deciding when a generator is responsible for network upgrades. So generators are often funding large transmission upgrades, as we've talked about before, hundreds of miles away. Some have proposed that we should instead use a transfer distribution factor of 20% as the cutoff, while others have proposed that we use voltage thresholds and percentage splits between generation and load. And again, as a reminder, the courts have said that costs just have to be allocated roughly commensurate with the benefits. If generators only pay for part of the upgrade costs, then I acknowledge that there is a concern that they will not site efficiently. But if generators still pay in full upfront and are credited for a percentage of the cost, the full upfront payment may still incentivize them to site efficiently. Also, since most of the new resources interconnecting are location constrained, I'm not sure how much of the concern of efficient siting is an issue. I also think it might be helpful if RTOs implemented a cash megawatt cap similar to what we have in CAISO as a way to discipline the siting and reduce costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So we're on to Chair LeVar and then Chair Thomas.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to comment on this from a non-RTO area perspective, and then Chair Thomas will be able to give some perspective from an RTO area. And I just want to state my agreement at a very high level with what's been said by several, that there has to be a recognition of two concepts. I mean, the requirement for load customers to pay for all appropriate transmission benefits is unquestionable. And there also has to be recognition of cost causation that gives some financial incentive on generator siting decisions. There has to be incentive there. And I also think cost causation requires some fresh analysis in the context of state policy choices, because it's certainly relevant to that issue. And I don't have all the answers, but that has to be evaluated in that context. Now, in the non-RTO area of the West, other than California, which has its ISO, the manner in which transmission upgrade costs are divided between generation and load customers has some unique characteristics where we're different from the RTO regions. And in my view, it's crucial for anything FERC does on this issue to recognize those differences and specifically provide how they will work and how they will operate in the non-RTO regions. So in the West, often generators can come to transmission providers in one of two primary ways, not the only ways, but often it's one of two ways, either integrated resource plan projects or PURPA projects. And I recognize this is not a PURPA task force, but you cannot talk about interconnection upgrade costs in the non-RTO Wests without talking about PURPA. You can't separate those two. So I'm going to briefly talk about it. But first, for IRP projects where the generation need has been developed in a resource plan, we have a transparent and competitive system, and it works. At least for parts of the West that I have experience in, these processes work. The IRP that generates the resource need has a transparent regulatory approval process that allows input from all stakeholders and regulatory review. Every state does their review a little bit differently. And the generation need identified by the IRP goes through a competitive, transparent procurement process. There's state approvals at many levels, and those vary by state. There's independent evaluators, usually hired by the states, and there's a transparent evaluation. And that evaluation includes transmission upgrade costs. So that process doesn't allow the kind of fiction that we see in some circles of the industry that want to espouse cheap sources of energy without accounting for transmission costs that are necessarily appurtenant to those energy sources. So these competitive procurement projects that are based on an IRP identified need, the transmission upgrade costs are part of the competitive procurement and are part of what's evaluated in that. And that provides transparency. Now for PURPA projects in the non-RTO West, it's a different scenario. PURPA provides unique challenges on this. And not to restate the obvious, but PURPA projects have not gone through a resource planning process. They have not gone through that vetting that happens in resource planning. Instead, state commissions are mandated by PURPA to look into our crystal ball and develop avoided cost prices that reflect ratepayer indifference without necessarily having projects in front of us. We have to establish the methodology and then we have to approve specific projects. Because this PURPA scenario gives us both the jurisdiction and the statutory obligation to establish avoided costs that respect ratepayer indifference, individual state commissions must retain flexibility to handle interconnection costs, interconnection upgrade costs in context of those goals. And we handle it in both scenarios. We handle it when we're setting the avoided cost pricing methodology, and we handle it when we approve individual PURPA projects. And so my encouragement on this issue is anything that we do that affects transmission upgrade costs needs to maintain that flexibility for the state commissions that are still operating under PURPA in non-RTO areas. We have to meet our obligations under that statute, and we have to have flexibility in fact-based, fact-specific scenarios to deal with how these interconnection upgrade costs apply to PURPA pricing and PURPA approval. And the other reason why I think that's important is the momentum that's happening across the West towards RTO formation. We have a lot of momentum. We're moving in that direction. We're moving more slowly than a lot of stakeholders would like, but the movement is happening. And if interconnection upgrade costs in the PURPA context were forced into a place where commissions had to reevaluate and had to change how they do that, I worry that can really chill the trust that we're building and the work that we're all putting in to develop more regional coordination. So that's my advocacy on this issue. Since I'm also representing the West, I do want to mention the comments that the Arizona Corporation Commission made in the ANOPR. They opined that interconnection upgrade costs should only be imposed on load customers if they can be demonstrated to be reliability costs. Now, I would personally probably add reliability benefits. I would personally add economic benefits to that, but I do join those others in this meeting who have expressed concern about how we allocate public policy benefits, and that's been discussed a lot, and so I don't have anything else to add to that. And that concludes my comments on that. I hope I didn't make too many people uncomfortable every time I said the word PURPA. I saw a little flinching from some, but nobody cut me off. So thank you.
Great. Chair Thomas.
Thank you. First of all, I should have read the thing closer. My JTIQ stuff was intended here. I'll still make a couple of points. I think the predictability that Commissioner Phillips mentioned is very important. Economically, you need to know what these costs are on the front end. Also, simple, as Commissioner Clements, of course, that relates to predictability, mentioned. I think you need metrics rather than formulas, because as everybody has said, roughly commensurate is the legal standard. And trying to hit all of those things, those necessary things at once is quite challenging. One thing I would point out about load flow models. Load flow models show, by definition, when you interconnect, the flow changes close to the interconnection. So when you're in SPP and you have more in the queue than you have load, because we're trying to export, the load flow model is going to show those benefits showing up where they already have sufficient generation and we're trying to export. So that's a limitation on load flow, at least that would apply regionally. And then again, I go back to the 0.6 benefit with JTIQ. If load pays all of it, it's not roughly commensurate. Goes the other way too. That's the hard part. I wish I had the solution once again.
Thank you. Chair Nelson, you were going to go through these three different options for cost sharing that have come out that we want to talk about today, and also share any views that you have before we open it up.
Yeah, great. So I think I'm going to walk through the three that we're aware of to do a little bit of table setting. I'm not going to opine on which one I like more. I think I want to just set that up for a discussion between everybody. So, I think what we're fundamentally trying to do, or what is fundamentally being proposed, is a way to have a little more balanced attack between participant funding and some sharing of the costs. And how do you align those costs and how do you align those benefits? So when I went through these proposals, each one of them has kind of a different take on the roughly commensurate piece that Ted was talking about. So the first one is voltage. And so I think aligning, or at least sharing costs of voltage, this has been done in a way to align costs based on broad-based benefits. So you imagine kind of like a highway, voltage for broad transmission, the kind of 345 kV and above, to distribute energy to a lot of different people through a backbone construction or an electric highway. That generally aligns with the rationale for participant funding, right? Sending price signals to generators with siting and location, shifting project and development of risk away from customers for those large backbone projects. MISO, I believe, and please, I'm going to say this to everyone, correct me because I'm just table setting, so the actual details, I'm not considering myself an expert on any of this, but I believe MISO has a well-tested voltage approach for this, which is about the customers pay 90% of the cost with the remaining 10% going system-wide. So that's a balanced approach. I believe NextEra has a proposal for like it's a crediting policy. So this is where generators pay for the upgrade costs through the interconnection substation, and load will ultimately cover any upgrades to network facilities and associated upgrades. So generators pay for the network upgrades that benefit them directly. So within the footprint of the substation, and then downstream network upgrades that will benefit load. I believe generators should fund those costs up front, but they will begin to be repaid in full, either through credits or through a lump sum within 20 years. So that's kind of a playing around with the temporal nature of how this cost is done. You can see that done a lot of time when we're doing distribution investment as well for our PUCs, playing around with how those costs and who's paying and who's upfronting the cost. Carrying charge will probably be a big issue with that one. ANEL has a proposal as well for a transfer distribution factor. That is trying to align benefits and cost causation principles at the site of the upgrade. So it's trying to say that it measures a percentage of the electricity produced by a generator, which travels to the transmission facility. And it's trying to balance that concept that if you are a small generator that is impacting the load and you're just impacting it a little bit, maybe you shouldn't pay to completely upgrade a substation, right? So it's trying to put kind of that impact that generator's having commensurate with the cost of that. So they started coming up with levels of tiers. So less than 5%, I believe it's between 5 and 20%, and then more than 20% around what's going to be considered a local and what's going to be considered like an allocated cost. So less impactful projects get a lower cost share, right? Which seems inherently fair. And projects making a bigger impact will pay a bigger share. Again, kind of lining up the impacts with the way the costs are going to be distributed. So those are three ideas, and there's others out there too, but I just wanted to walk through those. And now I'm not going to weigh in on that, and I'll let the group I'll kick it back to Jonathan to discuss.
Great. So I think we wanted to, we'll open it up. We have some time. And we want your reactions to the whole idea of cost sharing between participants and load. Is this okay in certain circumstances? Is it a slippery slope? Of the three that you just heard, or if you have another way of doing it, which ones are you more comfortable with? Which are you less comfortable with, and why? And let's just let's have a conversation. Chair French and then Commissioner Allen.
Thanks. And I'll say to start off, even though it's kind of presented as three options, I really look at these as two options. I think the second and third, from what I've heard, those are kind of a combined proposal from a broad range of stakeholders, where they are, I think the straw proposal is talking about for anything upstream of the interconnection point, that's going to be 100% participant funded. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then for downstream of the interconnection point, they're going to look at, are there any small local upgrades that are needed to be borne by the generator? And they're going to look at, as we mentioned, a flow-based measurement to see how much of that is caused by the individual customer. I've got some praise and some critique of that method. I guess the praise would be, I'm glad that there is a recognition that all the upstream costs should be borne by the generator. I don't think there's much debate on that. I like that it's a data-driven proposal. It provides some certain metrics on exactly how we're going to identify who is benefiting or who should be taking on some of the cost and how we measure what the cost sharing could be. And let's be real, there is a problem of unmet demand for these resources, and we need to get more of them on the system. And so, even though this isn't perfect, and I'm gonna move on to some critiques of it, I think it's something to build on, not something to dismiss. My critiques would be, this is probably moving us even farther toward a queue-based planning process. It's really looking at things on a generator by generator basis. I think not even cluster based. It's really looking at just what is the cheapest way to hook up individual generators on sort of an ERIS basis. It's not looking at the most optimal way to connect those generators or to find the lowest cost resources. There's no requirement the energy can actually be delivered to load. It's just getting them on the system. The other issue I do have is that it appears that we're only looking at those flows from the perspective of each individual generator. We're not even looking at it from the perspective of a cluster. And so I think there is a substantial potential that very few of the lower voltage upgrades are actually going to be identified and assigned to individual generators, even though as a whole, as a cluster, they might be causing the upgrades. And so, those are some critiques I would have. Again, I'm not against cost sharing of the facilities to some degree, but I do think, the cost should be shared between the clusters. And I guess my biggest concern is that the costs would somehow fall to the local zones. To the extent we are going to share costs between a cluster and load, we need to make sure that it's either being spread to the entire region or at least to some sort of deliverability zone. Where is the energy actually flowing and going to? So that is something that I want to make sure that if there is cost sharing, it does reflect who is actually benefiting. But now I want to move back up to the straw proposal of a voltage-based system. And I've got to say, I'm a little more optimistic about this approach. And it's because of my experience in power pool. I think most of you know that we have a very broad, simple cost sharing mechanism for transmission upgrades that we identify in our planning process. And it's called the highway byway method. It's 100% of upgrades under 100 kV go to the local zone. For upgrades between 100 and 300, those costs are split between the local zone and the region. And then for the large upgrades above 300 kV, they are spread entirely across the region. It's a simple, proactive approach. We know what it's going to apply for whatever is identified. And I think that simplicity has really helped getting upgrades built. And so I like the idea of trying to figure out a way to apply that sort of simple approach to the generator interconnection process. I'm not sure that the exact details would be the same, but I could certainly see a situation where we just agree that when you study a cluster and you identify network upgrades, if those are either upstream of the interconnection point or they're below 100 kV, generators participant fund all of that. If it's between 100 and 300 kV, perhaps load takes on some of the cost because they're starting to get more benefits from higher voltage upgrades. If it's above 300 kV, there's probably a reason and rationale to allow even more cost sharing. Maybe the costs are shared 50-50 at that point. Now, to meet roughly commensurate, it has to be backed up by data. There needs to be a study that shows that whatever percentage sharing we choose for these voltage levels, it is roughly commensurate with how the benefits are split. We had a study underlying the highway byway method. Those percentages weren't picked out of thin air. They were the result of a study showing who received the benefits of different voltage types. And so I could certainly see a requirement that the RTOs do a study to figure out what types of upgrades benefit generation versus load, and then that be proactively applied moving forward. I think that fits well with Commissioner Clement's principle of trying to find simplicity and trying to find something that just can be proactively applied, and people have certainty that this is how costs will be divided when we identify upgrades. So that's what I like about, I guess, a voltage-based approach. But I'm certainly willing to look at any option that have a data-driven metrics behind it. Thank you.
Great. And so for the kind of where you ended, that the upgrade costs in your mind had the most promise, then you put out a little more of a nuanced three-step than the kind of simple dividing line that Chairman Nelson described. I just had one following question, which is, were you thinking that that an RTO would do kind of one study to figure out the dividing lines and a reasonable share that maybe got updated every whatever 5 or 10 years, or were you thinking for almost every cluster study they would have to do that? Yeah.
So that's a great question. I would say right now we're doing something like that in the ongoing JTIQ process between SPP and MISO. On an individual study basis, we're trying to figure out what are the costs and benefits associated with this individual set of lines. I would say it's pretty onerous to think that we're going to do that kind of study for every single facility that's developed in an upgrade process. To me, that's going to slow down the queue even more. What I would like to see is more like what SPP has done with the highway byway method for its regional cost allocation, which is we did one study 10 or 15 years ago, hired a very good consulting firm to understand what was a roughly commensurate way to identify benefits based on voltage levels of upgrades. And that's what we have applied moving forward. Now we evaluate on an ongoing basis whether that still is those assumptions underlying that study are still accurate. But I think the most productive way to move this forward is to have a data-driven study to understand what types of upgrades benefit which types of customers. It's not going to be the same for every single facility, but roughly how things are going to work out, and then just apply that moving forward once you find a method that is roughly commensurate.
Thanks. Commissioner Allen.
I won't repeat the points that I liked from Commissioner French. There were so many, and I thought he did just a great job. I will say that, increasingly I appreciate the voltage differentiation approach. I think that, there may be relative merits to different approaches. I do like, the concept of actually doing some analysis to help inform the preferred approach to address the challenge of aligning benefits with the mechanism. So, intuitively, I think the voltage differentiation approach kind of gets me there, but I'd rather have, analysis behind that to help me to kind of get over the hump. But other than that, I'll just say I'll adopt by reference comments of Commissioner French.
Great. Chair Thomas, and hopefully some others have some reactions in this area as well. Go ahead.
Very quickly, when designing some sort of a sharing of cost mechanism, I think Commissioner Nelson made a very important point. You can do it on the front end or you can do it on the back end. That's an important policy distinction that has to be figured out. Do you